Hello there, and welcome to my channel. I'm so glad you found your way here today. Tonight we're going to slow all the way down. We're going to talk about mothers, not the version of motherhood that ends up in photo albums, but the quieter one. The one made of small, uncounted moments that rarely get spoken aloud. Some of what we cover tonight is biology. Some of it is history. Some of it is simply the ordinary invisible math of love. None of it needs to be memorized. You can let it wash over you instead, the way warm water settles around tired shoulders. And before we begin, if you enjoy what I share here, please leave a like and hit subscribe. It's how others find their way to this little corner too. There are 100 small truths waiting for us tonight, and we will move through them together gently, one at a time, until your eyes grow heavy and the world gets soft around the edges. Now let's begin. You might assume that a mother's transformation starts the moment a test confirms the news, that her body waits politely for permission before it begins its work. It does not wait. Within days of conception, before any missed period, before any conscious awareness at all, a cascade of hormonal signals is already rewriting the chemistry of her blood. Progesterone rises quietly. The lining of the uterus begins preparing a home for a cluster of cells too small to see without a microscope. Blood vessels start to soften and expand, readying themselves for a demand that has not yet been announced. This is the strange, tender truth of early pregnancy. The body moves first, and the mind catches up later. A woman might feel only a faint tiredness, a subtle shift in appetite. Nothing dramatic enough to explain. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, her endocrine system is already reorganizing itself around a presence she cannot yet name. Some researchers describe this as the body's own form of quiet faith chemistry, proceeding on trust before evidence arrives. By the time a mother knows she is pregnant, her body has often been mothering for 2 or 3 weeks already, unannounced and unacknowledged. It is a small, strange kind of devotion, one that begins in secret, cell by cell, long before it ever becomes a sentence spoken out loud to another person. Long before a name is chosen, before a room is painted, before anyone else is told, something in her has already said yes. Somewhere around the 2nd month of pregnancy, something remarkable and rarely discussed begins to happen inside a mother's body. Fetal cells, tiny and few, slip across the placental barrier and enter her bloodstream directly. Scientists call this phenomenon fetal microchimerism, a term that sounds clinical but describes something almost poetic. 2 bodies briefly physically merging. These cells are not simply passing through. Many of them travel outward, settling into a mother's organs, her skin, even her bone marrow. Researchers have found them lodged in maternal tissue years, sometimes decades after a child was born. In a very real, measurable sense, part of a child remains inside a mother long after birth, separates their 2 bodies. This exchange is not symbolic. It has been observed under laboratory conditions, tracked through genetic markers that could only have come from the child, not the mother herself. Some scientists believe these traveling cells may even help repair maternal tissue during illness, quietly assisting the body that once nourished them. It is a strange kind of reciprocity, unplanned and unspoken, woven directly into biology rather than sentiment. A mother carries her child in the ordinary sense for only 9 months, but in this quieter cellular sense, traces of that child may remain part of her for the rest of her life. It happens without ceremony. Without her noticing, deep inside, a body already busy building a person she has not yet met. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Some of a child's cells do not simply pass through a mother's body, they settle directly into her brain. Autopsy studies have found fetal-derived cells embedded in maternal brain tissue, present even in women who died decades after giving birth. These are not passive passengers. Evidence suggests some of these cells integrate into neural structures, becoming, in a very literal sense, part of the physical architecture of a mother's mind. Researchers first noticed this pattern while studying women who had been pregnant with sons, since a genetic marker unique to male cells made the tracing easier to confirm. What they found reshaped how many scientists think about the boundary between two bodies during pregnancy. It suggests that boundary is far less solid than it appears. A mother's brain, the very organ responsible for memory, judgment, and love itself, may carry small physical traces of a child within its own tissue. Some researchers have speculated cautiously that this could influence maternal behavior on a biological level, though that idea remains an open question rather than settled fact. What is certain is the presence of the cells themselves, quietly folded into neural tissue, undetectable without specialized testing. There is something almost startling in the idea that love, in this case, may not be only metaphorical. Somewhere inside the machinery of thought and memory itself, a small literal piece of a child may remain long after that child has grown and gone. Picture for a moment the inside of a pregnant woman's skull, not as something static, but as a structure quietly under construction. Magnetic resonance imaging studies have shown that gray matter volume changes measurably during pregnancy, particularly in regions associated with social cognition and emotional processing. This is not a subtle statistical footnote. The changes are consistent enough that researchers have been able to identify with striking accuracy whether a brain scan belongs to a woman who has been pregnant simply by examining the tissue itself. The regions affected tend to be the ones responsible for interpreting facial expressions, understanding others' mental states, and responding to emotional cues. In other words, pregnancy appears to physically prepare the brain for the specific demanding work of reading a creature who cannot yet speak. A newborn cannot say when it is hungry, frightened, or in pain. It can only communicate through expression, sound, and posture, and something in the maternal brain seems to sharpen itself in advance to meet that need. This reshaping happens gradually month by month, alongside the more visible changes of pregnancy, hidden entirely from view. No mirror shows it. No scale measures it. Yet by the time a child is born, the mother meeting that child is not, neurologically speaking, quite the same woman who conceived it months earlier. Her mind has been quietly renovating itself the entire time, preparing rooms she did not know she needed, for a guest she had not yet met. If you were designing a brain specifically built to understand a creature who cannot use words, you might choose to sharpen very particular regions, the ones responsible for empathy, threat detection, and emotional attunement. This is in effect what appears to happen naturally during pregnancy. The structural changes observed in maternal brains cluster heavily around areas like the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and regions tied to theory of mind, the brain's capacity to imagine what another being might be thinking or feeling. Researchers have found that these changes correlate with how mothers respond to images of their own infants, showing heightened activation compared to images of unfamiliar babies. In practical terms, this may explain something many mothers describe, but rarely have language for, an almost instinctive sense of knowing what a particular cry means or what a particular expression signals long before it could be explained logically. It is not mind-reading in any mystical sense. It is closer to a finely tuned instrument, shaped gradually by hormonal and neurological changes to detect subtle signals most other people would miss entirely. A stranger, holding the same infant, might hear only crying. A mother, her brain quietly recalibrated over months, may hear something closer to a specific request. This attunement does not arrive instantly and does not apply equally to every mother, since biology is rarely so uniform. But the underlying pattern is real, and it offers a strange kind of comfort that some of what looks like maternal instinct may in fact be measurable architecture built quietly cell by cell in the months before a baby ever arrives. You might expect the mind to fully reset once a child grows up and leaves the day-to-day intensity of early parenting behind. Instead, Longitudinal studies have found that certain structural brain changes associated with motherhood persist for years, in some cases for over a decade after childbirth. Researchers scanning the brains of mothers long after their children had grown past infancy still found measurable differences compared to women who had never given birth. The regions most affected remained consistent with those tied to social processing and emotional recognition, the same systems that had adapted so heavily during pregnancy itself. This suggests that motherhood is not simply a temporary neurological event, brief and reversible, once the demands of infancy pass. It appears instead to leave a lasting signature, subtle but measurable, on the architecture of the mind. Some scientists believe this may help explain why many mothers continue to feel finely attuned to their children's emotional states well into adulthood, long after any practical need for constant vigilance has faded. The wiring built during those early years does not simply switch off. It lingers quietly present in the background of everyday thought. There is something almost moving about this endurance, the idea that a mind can be reshaped once gently and permanently by the experience of caring for another person. Long after diapers and midnight feedings are only memories, something in the brain itself still remembers, still listens a little more closely than it once did, still carries forward that early, careful attentiveness. Consider for a moment what it means to ask a body to circulate significantly more blood than it ever has before, and to do so gradually enough that most people never notice the strain. During pregnancy, a woman's blood volume increases dramatically, rising by nearly 50% above her pre-pregnancy levels by the third trimester. This is not a minor adjustment. It is one of the most significant physiological changes the human body undergoes outside of illness or injury. The heart must respond accordingly, increasing its output to circulate this expanded volume efficiently, delivering oxygen and nutrients not just to her own tissues, but to a rapidly developing second body entirely dependent on hers. This expansion happens gradually, across many weeks, allowing the cardiovascular system time to adapt, though the underlying demand remains constant and considerable throughout. Many of the more uncomfortable symptoms of pregnancy, from swelling to shortness of breath, trace back directly to this dramatic shift in blood volume and circulation. It is easy to overlook since it happens internally and visibly, without any outward drama to mark its progress. Yet it represents an extraordinary act of physiological generosity, a body quietly re-engineering its own most fundamental systems to support a life it has not yet met face to face. Long before a mother holds her child for the first time, her own heart has already been working in ways it never had to, before adjusting itself again and again, around a need that was never entirely her own. By the later stages of pregnancy, a mother's heart is no longer simply her own organ, working at its usual pace. It has become something closer to a shared engine pumping for two bodies simultaneously. Cardiac output, the amount of blood the heart pumps per minute, rises substantially during pregnancy, often increasing by 30 to 50% compared to pre-pregnancy levels. This added workload continues for months, without rest, without days off, without any pause for recovery. The heart beats faster, on average, throughout pregnancy, and it does so continuously day and night, whether the mother is awake or asleep, active or resting. This is easy to take for granted precisely because it happens automatically, without conscious effort or decision. No one has to remind a pregnant woman's heart to work harder. It simply does, adjusting itself moment to moment to meet a demand that grows steadily as pregnancy progresses. By the third trimester, this increased cardiac workload is comparable to the strain placed on the heart during sustained physical exertion, except sustained not for minutes, but for months on end. It is, in a very real physiological sense, an endurance event, one that receives none of the recognition typically given to athletic achievement. And when the pregnancy ends, when the baby finally arrives, that same heart does not simply return to being just her own. It continues quietly and without complaint, adjusting itself again and again to a life that has just begun outside her body. Before pregnancy, the uterus is a modest organ roughly the size of a small pear, tucked quietly within the pelvis where it does its ordinary, unremarkable work. Over the course of pregnancy, it grows into something almost unrecognizable, expanding until it reaches the size of a large watermelon by full term. This is not gradual in the way a plant grows slow and steady across seasons. It happens within a matter of months, a rate of expansion that would be considered extraordinary in almost any other tissue in the human body. The muscle fibers of the uterus do not simply stretch thin the way a balloon might. They actually multiply and thicken, building genuine new tissue capable of the powerful contractions labor will eventually require. By the end of pregnancy, this organ that once weighed only a few ounces can weigh over 2 pounds, having grown roughly 20 times its original size. It pushes against the ribs, crowds the lungs, shifts the position of internal organs that had occupied the same quiet space for the mother's entire life until that point. And then, remarkably after birth, it begins shrinking again, contracting back down over the following weeks, until it approaches something close to its original size. Few organs in the human body are asked to grow so dramatically, function so powerfully, and then recede so completely, all within less than a year. It is architecture built for a single purpose, constructed, quickly used with tremendous force, and then quietly dismantled once its work is done, leaving barely a trace of the transformation it once made possible. As the uterus expands upward through pregnancy, it eventually runs out of room within the pelvis and begins pressing directly against the ribcage itself, forcing the body to make structural accommodations. Research using imaging studies has shown that a woman's ribcage actually widens during pregnancy, with the lower ribs flaring outward to create additional space. This is not a temporary shift that reverses entirely after birth. Many women find that their ribcage remains slightly wider than it was before pregnancy, sometimes permanently, a subtle but measurable change to the actual skeletal structure of the body. It is easy to imagine pregnancy as something that primarily affects soft tissue skin, stretching, weight shifting. But this particular change involves bone itself, the most rigid and seemingly permanent part of the human frame. The ribcage does not simply tolerate this growth, it actively reshapes itself to accommodate it, hormones softening the cartilage between ribs, enough to allow this gradual widening to occur. Many women later notice that clothing fits differently than it once did, not simply due to weight changes, but because the underlying architecture of the chest itself has shifted. It is a strange, quiet kind of permanence, one rarely discussed outside of medical literature, hidden beneath clothing and skin, where no one else would think to look for it. Long after a child is grown, long after every visible sign of pregnancy has faded, a mother's own skeleton may still carry this small structural reminder, an adjustment made once and never entirely undone. In the earliest hours after birth, before regular milk production begins, a mother's body produces a substance called colostrum, often thick yellowish, and remarkably different in composition from the milk that follows days later. This is not simply an early or unfinished version of breast milk. It is a distinct substance engineered by the body for a very specific and urgent purpose. Colostrum is extraordinarily rich in antibodies, particularly one called immunoglobulin A, which coats the lining of a newborn's digestive tract and helps prevent harmful bacteria from taking hold in a gut that has never encountered the outside world before. A newborn's intestinal lining is at birth unusually permeable, designed this way so that beneficial antibodies from colostrum can pass through more easily into the bloodstream. This window of heightened permeability does not last long, closing within the first day or two of life, which is part of why colostrum's arrival is so precisely timed. It is produced in small quantities, often only a few teaspoons per feeding, not because the body is limited, but because a newborn's stomach at birth is roughly the size of a small marble and cannot hold much more than that. Every element of this substance appears calibrated with striking precision. The volume, the timing, the composition, all suited exactly to the narrow biological window a newborn occupies in its first hours of life. It is easy to overlook something so small in quantity, easy to assume that more must always be better. But colostrum suggests otherwise, a reminder that some of the most important gifts a mother gives are measured not by how much there is, but by how precisely it was made to fit the moment it was needed. Perhaps one of the more striking discoveries in maternal physiology is this: breast milk is not a fixed, unchanging substance. It responds dynamically to a baby's immediate health needs, sometimes within hours. When a nursing infant becomes sick, whether through bacterial or viral infection, researchers have found that the composition of the mother's milk changes in response. Increasing concentrations of specific antibodies and immune-supportive compounds tailored to that particular illness. This process appears to happen through direct contact during feeding itself, in which certain signals from the baby's saliva may be detected by receptors around the nipple, prompting the mammary glands to adjust their output accordingly. It functions almost like a feedback loop between two bodies, still deeply connected even after the physical separation of birth. A healthy baby and a sick baby may quite literally be receiving different milk from the same mother, adapted to whatever immune support is currently needed most. This remains an active area of ongoing research, and scientists are still working to fully map the mechanisms involved, but the observed changes in antibody concentration during illness are well documented. It suggests a level of biological responsiveness that is difficult to fully appreciate, a body continuing to communicate with and care for another body without either one consciously directing it. Long after birth, as physically separated mother and child, this quiet exchange continues, invisible, automatic, and remarkably precise, a form of protection offered without ever requiring a single spoken word between them. Even in the depths of sleep, when conscious awareness has largely switched off, a mother's brain retains a striking capacity to recognize one particular sound above all others. Studies using brain imaging and sleep monitoring have found that mothers respond to recordings of their own infant's cry with measurably different brain activity than they show in response to a stranger's infant crying, even while asleep. This recognition does not require full wakefulness. It appears to operate on a more primal level, bypassing the slower, more deliberate processing typically associated with conscious thought. In practical terms, this means a mother can often stir, wake, or respond specifically to her own child's cry, while remaining undisturbed by other unrelated sounds in the environment, including other babies crying nearby. It is not simply a matter of volume or intensity. Researchers have found that the auditory signature of an infant's cry, the specific pitch, rhythm, and pattern, becomes something the maternal brain learns to recognize with unusual speed, sometimes within the very first days after questionable birth. This learned recognition appears to be reinforced by the same hormonal systems activated during childbirth and breastfeeding systems that seem to prioritize this particular sound above nearly all others. It is easy to imagine sleep as a state of total disconnection from the outside world, and in most respects it is. Yet for a new mother, some quiet, essential thread of attentiveness seems to remain intact, even then tuned specifically to one small particular voice, standing ready to respond the moment it calls out, even from somewhere deep within an otherwise dreaming mind. There is something worth pausing on here: the speed at which this recognition occurs. Under most circumstances, the human brain requires a measurable amount of time to process and identify a sound, distinguishing it from background noise, comparing it against memory, arriving eventually at recognition. Studies suggest that a mother's brain identifies her own infant's cry unusually quickly, activating relevant brain regions faster than it does for unfamiliar or neutral sounds of similar volume and pitch. Researchers believe this accelerated processing may be linked to the way emotionally significant sounds are prioritized by the brain's threat detection and attention systems, areas that evolved to respond rapidly to signals, indicating potential danger to offspring. In essence, a baby's cry may be processed less like ordinary background noise and more like an urgent alarm, one specifically calibrated to bypass some of the usual delays involved in auditory processing. This does not mean a mother consciously decides to prioritize the sound. It happens automatically, beneath the level of deliberate thought, more reflex than choice. It is a small but telling detail. This idea that recognition itself can be accelerated by emotional significance, that the brain treats certain sounds as urgent enough to warrant a shortcut through its usual, more careful process. Long before a mother can put words to what she is feeling in that moment, some deeper part of her mind has already identified the sound, already begun preparing a response, moving faster than thought itself toward the small voice, calling out to her. During childbirth, and again during breastfeeding, a mother's body releases substantial amounts of a hormone called oxytocin, often associated with bonding, though its effects extend considerably further than affection alone. Oxytocin plays a significant role in shaping maternal behavior, including heightened vigilance toward potential threats and increased attentiveness to an infant's needs and signals. Animal studies have shown that oxytocin can increase protective and even defensive behaviors in new mothers, a pattern researchers believe likely extends in modified form to human maternal behavior as well. This is not simply an emotional experience happening in isolation. It is a hormonally driven shift in how the brain prioritizes information, tuning attention more sharply toward anything that might represent risk to a newly vulnerable infant. Many new mothers describe a heightened awareness they cannot fully explain, a tendency to notice small sounds, subtle changes, potential dangers they might never have registered before becoming a parent. This aligns closely with what researchers have observed at a neurological level, changes in activity within brain regions associated with threat assessment and protective response. It is easy to think of vigilance as simply a personality trait, something some people naturally possess more than others. But in new mothers, at least in part, it appears to be something closer to a temporary recalibration of the nervous system itself, driven by real, measurable hormonal shifts. This heightened state does not last forever at its peak intensity, but its foundations laid down during those early hormonal surges often linger quietly for a very long time afterward. Something curious happens to sleep architecture after a woman becomes a mother, and it does not fully reverse once the exhausting early months of infancy pass. Research comparing sleep patterns of mothers to non-mothers has found that mothers often spend less time in the deepest stages of sleep, waking more easily and more frequently in response to ambient sound. This shift appears linked to the same hormonal and neurological changes associated with heightened vigilance during early caregiving changes that seem to leave a lasting imprint on how the brain manages rest itself. A mother might sleep for what looks from the outside like a full and ordinary night, yet internally, her sleep may remain shallower than it once was, more easily disturbed, less completely surrendered to unconsciousness than it was before she had a child. This is not necessarily something a mother notices consciously, since the change tends to be gradual and often becomes simply her new normal. Partners sleeping in the very same bed sometimes report sleeping through sounds that wake a mother instantly, a small but telling asymmetry that many households experience without ever examining closely. Sleep researchers describe this as a kind of persistent, low-level readiness, the nervous system remaining slightly more alert even during rest, as though some part of the body never fully stopped listening for a particular sound. It is a subtle cost, rarely mentioned, rarely complained about, folded quietly into the ordinary rhythm of days and nights that follow long after infancy itself has ended. What makes this pattern particularly striking is its persistence extending well beyond the period when a mother is actually getting up for nighttime feedings or soothing a crying infant. Studies tracking maternal sleep over time have found that this heightened tendency toward wakefulness can continue for months after a baby begins sleeping through the night, long after any practical need for that vigilance has technically ended. The body, in other words, does not immediately recognize that the emergency has passed. It continues operating under the assumption that interruption might come at any moment, holding on to a readiness that no longer serves an obvious purpose. Researchers believe this may be tied to lingering hormonal effects combined with deeply reinforced neural pathways built during those early demanding months. Pathways that do not simply switch off the moment circumstances change. A mother may find herself waking briefly at small sounds, a year or more after her child began sleeping soundly through the night, unsure why her body still responds this way. There is no single moment when this vigilance formally ends, no clear line where the nervous system decides the danger has passed and rest can finally be complete again. Instead, it fades, slowly, unevenly, often taking far longer to fully release than anyone would expect. It is a quiet kind of endurance, this lingering wakefulness. A body still standing watch, long after the reason for standing watch has technically moved on. Within the very first days after birth, before a mother has had significant time to learn her baby's features by sight, something remarkable happens through an entirely different sense. Studies have found that mothers can reliably identify their own newborn by smell alone, distinguishing their baby's scent from that of other infants with striking accuracy, sometimes within as little as 1 to 2 days after birth. This recognition appears to develop with unusual speed compared to how scent-based recognition typically works in humans, who generally rely far more heavily on sight than smell. Researchers believe this rapid olfactory bonding may be reinforced by skin-to-skin contact immediately after birth, a period during which certain hormonal systems appear especially receptive to forming these kinds of fast, durable associations. Newborns, in turn, show a similar capacity, often turning preferentially toward the scent of their own mother's skin over that of an unfamiliar woman, suggesting the recognition runs in both directions simultaneously. This mutual scent-based bonding likely predates spoken language by an enormous span of evolutionary history. A much older, more primal channel of connection that continues operating quietly beneath conscious awareness even now. It is easy to overlook something as seemingly simple as smell, easy to assume that recognition requires sight or sound to feel meaningful. Yet in those very first days, when everything else about a new baby still feels unfamiliar and uncertain, scent alone may already be doing some of the deepest work of recognition, forming a thread of connection built before either mother or child has any real language to describe what is happening between them. Long before a newborn understands a single word, it already recognizes something deeply familiar in the particular sound of its mother's voice, a recognition that begins remarkably early. Research has shown that infants can distinguish their mother's voice from other voices within days of birth, and some evidence suggests this recognition may even begin before birth, formed through sound transmitted while still in the womb. When a distressed newborn hears its mother's voice specifically, studies have documented measurable calming effects, including changes in heart rate and reductions in crying effects that are notably weaker or absent when an unfamiliar voice speaks the very same words. This is not simply about tone or gentleness in some general sense. since researchers have found that infants respond specifically to the particular vocal patterns, rhythms and frequencies unique to their own mother's voice patterns they had already been quietly absorbing for months before birth. Sound travels differently through amniotic fluid than through open air, muffled and low, yet apparently distinct enough for a developing baby to begin learning its particular contours well before ever hearing it clearly. By the time a newborn arrives into the world in a strange and lovely sense, it may already be listening for someone it has technically never seen, but has, in another way, already come to know intimately through months of that voice. It is one of the quieter forms of recognition a new mother receives, rarely announced, but deeply present, this sense that of every sound in an unfamiliar new world, hers is the one already familiar, already trusted, already capable of bringing calm to a body still learning how to exist outside her own. If you gather everything we have covered so far, the shifting blood volume, the reshaped brain, the recognition built through scent and sound, a striking pattern emerges. Nearly all of it happens automatically, silently, without a mother consciously choosing or announcing any of it. She does not decide to widen her ribcage, does not deliberately calibrate her milk to fight infection, does not consciously train her sleeping brain to recognize one particular cry among thousands. Her body simply does these things quietly and continuously, long before she has language sophisticated enough to describe what is actually happening inside her. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes something easy to overlook. So much of what we call maternal instinct is not mystical or vague. It is measurable, physical, biological, built through processes occurring far beneath conscious awareness. And it begins early weeks and months before a mother ever holds her child, before she has any real opportunity to reflect on what her body is doing on her behalf. There is a kind of quiet trust embedded in this pattern. A body proceeding forward with tremendous complexity and precision, without waiting for permission or explanation. By the time a mother finally does speak about what she has experienced, if she ever fully puts it into words at all, an enormous amount of invisible work has already been done. This is where the spark of understanding begins tonight, not with grand declarations, but with this quiet recognition. Motherhood starts long before it is ever spoken aloud, built silently, cell by cell in the dark. Consider for a moment what it actually means to add up the small, ordinary moments of caregiving across an entire childhood. The feedings, the soothing, the driving, the waiting, the watching. Time use studies conducted across multiple countries have found that mothers who are primary caregivers spend on average tens of thousands of hours engaged directly in childcare activities, from birth through late adolescence. If translated into a more familiar frame of reference, this figure is comparable to working a full-time job for over a decade, except without wages, without scheduled breaks, and often without any clearly defined end to the workday at all. This number does not include the countless smaller moments that are harder to formally measure: the mental tracking of schedules, the quiet worry carried while doing unrelated tasks, the constant low-level readiness to respond if needed. Researchers who study time use often note that childcare, unlike most paid labor, does not pause simply because a mother is tired, unwell, or overwhelmed, since a child's needs rarely wait for a convenient moment to arise. When this cumulative time is compared across different countries and cultures, the underlying pattern remains strikingly consistent. Primary caregivers, most often mothers, contribute an extraordinary volume of hours that would, in nearly any other context, be considered a significant and demanding profession. Yet this work rarely appears on a resume, rarely earns a formal title, and rarely receives any accounting at all outside of academic research. It exists instead as something simply absorbed into daily life, an enormous quantity of time and effort so thoroughly normalized that its true scale is rarely recognized even by the mothers giving it. New parenthood is often described casually as exhausting, a word so overused it can lose its actual weight, so it helps to look at what the research specifically shows. Studies tracking sleep in new mothers have found that in the first year after childbirth, mothers lose on average several hundred hours of sleep compared to their pre-pregnancy baseline, a deficit that accumulates gradually across months of interrupted nights. When converted into a more tangible measure, this accumulated sleep loss is roughly equivalent to going without any sleep at all for several consecutive weeks, though in reality, it is spread thin night after night in smaller fragments that rarely allow full physical recovery. Sleep researchers note that fragmented sleep, waking multiple times per night, rather than losing an equivalent block all at once, is often more physically taxing than a single continuous period of sleep deprivation, since the body struggles to complete full sleep cycles necessary for genuine restoration. This means the toll on a new mother's body may, in some respects, be even greater than the raw hour count alone suggests. And this sleep debt does not remain isolated to the first exhausting weeks after birth, since many mothers report ongoing sleep disruption, extending well into the following year, particularly if breastfeeding continues, or if a child experiences irregular sleep patterns of their own. It is a quiet, cumulative toll, rarely fully repaid, rarely openly discussed in specific terms, absorbed instead into the everyday, unremarkable language of simply being tired, a phrase far too small to capture what is actually being carried. Economists have long faced a strange and telling gap in how national wealth is measured, a gap centered directly on caregiving work performed inside the home. When researchers have attempted to assign a monetary value to unpaid caregiving labor, calculating what it would cost to hire someone to perform the equivalent work, the resulting figures reach into the trillions of dollars annually on a global scale. This labor includes childcare, but extends further, covering household management, emotional support, and the countless small tasks that keep a family functioning day to day. Despite this staggering estimated value, none of it appears in traditional measures of economic output, since unpaid work performed within a household has historically been excluded entirely from how national economies calculate productivity and growth. This exclusion is not accidental, but rather reflects centuries-old economic frameworks that were built around paid market labor frameworks that simply never accounted for work happening outside of formal employment. Researchers studying this gap often note a striking irony. Caregiving work is simultaneously described as invaluable in cultural and emotional terms, while being treated as literally valueless within the formal systems used to measure a nation's economic health. Mothers who continue to perform a significant majority of this unpaid caregiving work across most studied societies effectively contribute enormous, largely invisible economic value that never appears in any official accounting. It is one of the more quietly striking contradictions embedded in modern economic life, an entire category of essential labor worth trillions by conservative estimate that remains almost entirely unmeasured, uncompensated, and unacknowledged in the numbers that supposedly describe how an economy actually works. Despite significant social and legal changes over recent decades, a persistent and well-documented gap remains in how unpaid caregiving labor is distributed between men and women across the globe. Time use surveys conducted across dozens of countries consistently find that women perform several times more unpaid care and domestic work than men, a pattern that holds true across a wide range of cultures, income levels, and family structures. This gap does not appear to be closing quickly, even in countries with strong formal commitments to gender equality in other areas of public and economic life. Researchers studying this imbalance note that it often persists, even in households where both partners work full-time paid jobs outside the home, suggesting the disparity is not simply a matter of who has more available time, but something more deeply embedded in social expectation and household habit. This unpaid work includes not only direct childcare but cooking, cleaning, coordinating schedules, and managing the countless small logistical details required to keep a household running smoothly. When totaled across a lifetime, this consistent imbalance can represent an enormous cumulative difference in time, energy, and personal freedom between men and women within the very same households. It is a pattern so consistent across such different societies that researchers increasingly view it not as an incidental cultural quirk, but as a deeply structural feature of how caregiving responsibilities continue to be distributed, largely along the same lines they have followed for generations. Despite so much else having changed around it, there is a specific, well-documented shift that occurs in many women's careers after the birth of a child, one that researchers have tracked closely across labor markets in numerous countries. Studies following mothers over time have found that a significant proportion reduce their paid working hours after childbirth, and for many, this reduction is not temporary, but becomes a lasting change to their working pattern for years afterward. This shift often happens gradually, rather than through one dramatic decision, a slightly reduced schedule here, a declined promotion there, small adjustments made repeatedly in response to the ongoing demands of caregiving. Economists refer to this pattern using a specific term, the motherhood penalty, distinguishing it explicitly from the career trajectories typically observed among fathers whose working hours and income often remain largely unaffected by the arrival of children, or in some studies even increase slightly afterward. This asymmetry is notable precisely because it reveals how differently caregiving responsibilities continue to be distributed, even when both parents enter parenthood with similar career trajectories and ambitions beforehand. Many mothers describe this reduction not as a fully free choice, but as the most practical available option given limited childcare access, workplace inflexibility, or simply the accumulated weight of managing a household alongside paid employment. Over time, these seemingly small adjustments compound, shaping career paths in ways that are rarely fully visible in the moment they are made. It is a quiet redirection, decision by decision, that only becomes fully clear in hindsight once years have passed and the cumulative shape of a working life has settled into something noticeably different from what it might otherwise have been. When researchers trace these smaller incremental career adjustments forward across an entire working life, the cumulative financial impact becomes strikingly clear and in many cases quite large. Longitudinal economic studies have found that mothers on average earn significantly less over their lifetimes than women without children, even after accounting for factors like education, industry, and prior work experience. This gap tends to widen with each additional child, and it rarely closes fully even once children have grown into adulthood and the most intensive caregiving years have long passed. Part of this effect stems directly from reduced working hours, but researchers have also identified something they call a perception penalty, evidence suggesting that mothers are sometimes viewed by employers as less committed or less available, regardless of their actual performance or ambition, a bias that can affect hiring, promotion, and salary decisions independent of any real change in the mother's own capability. This particular earnings gap stands in notable contrast to patterns observed among fathers, some studies even finding a modest wage increase associated with fatherhood, an effect researchers sometimes call the fatherhood bonus, tied to perceptions of increased stability and responsibility, rather than any actual reduction in working capacity. The cumulative result tracked across an entire career can represent a substantial sum, often reaching into hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost lifetime earnings for many mothers. It is a slow, largely invisible erosion, unfolding one small decision at a time, rarely obvious in any single year, yet unmistakably clear when the full arc of a working life is finally examined from beginning to end. If you were to plot a mother's earnings alongside those of a childless woman with a similar career starting point, the two lines would likely begin close together, then gradually diverge in a pattern. Economists have studied extensively across many labor markets. Research consistently shows that the wage gap between mothers and non-mothers is not present at the start of a woman's career, but emerges and steadily widens specifically after the birth of a first child, growing further with each subsequent child added to the family. This divergence tends to happen gradually rather than all at once. A smaller raise here, a missed opportunity there, incremental differences that compound quietly year after year until the overall gap becomes substantial and difficult to ignore. Economists studying this pattern have found it holds true across a wide range of industries and education levels, suggesting the underlying cause is not simply about individual career choices, but something more structural, tied closely to how workplaces are designed around an assumption of continuous, uninterrupted availability, an assumption caregiving responsibilities frequently disrupt. Interestingly, this same wage gap is often far smaller, or in some studies nearly absent, between fathers and childless men. A striking asymmetry given that both parents technically became parents at the very same moment. This divergence tells a quiet but important story about how caregiving costs continue to fall unevenly, shaping two very different economic paths from what began in most cases as two very similar starting points separated only by the different ways each parent's caregiving responsibilities came to be recognized or overlooked within the systems around them. For most of human history, childbirth carried a level of danger that can be genuinely difficult to fully grasp from a modern vantage point. Historical records and demographic studies estimate that in many societies prior to the 20th century, maternal mortality rates were extraordinarily high, with some estimates suggesting that a meaningful percentage of women died as a direct result of pregnancy or childbirth complications at some point across their reproductive years. Common causes included severe bleeding, infection, and obstructed labor conditions that today are typically manageable with modern medical intervention, but which offered few effective treatment options throughout most of recorded history. This risk was not evenly distributed, since wealthier women with access to better nutrition and some form of medical attendance generally fared somewhat better than women in poverty, though childbirth remained dangerous across nearly every social class for centuries. Historians studying this period note that this pervasive risk shaped entire cultural attitudes toward pregnancy, with many societies developing elaborate rituals, prayers, and precautions specifically intended to help protect women through what was widely understood to be one of the most physically dangerous events a woman was likely to face in her lifetime. It is worth pausing on this simple fact. For the vast majority of human history, choosing to become a mother meant accepting a real and substantial risk to one's own life, a risk faced repeatedly by women who often went on to have multiple children despite having witnessed firsthand within their own communities the very real dangers involved. This history remains embedded quietly within nearly every family lineage. Generations of women who faced this risk directly, most of them never having any language available to fully describe just how much courage that quiet, repeated choice actually required. The 20th century brought remarkable medical advances that transformed the landscape of childbirth safety, though the story remains more complicated than a simple universal triumph. Improvements including antibiotics, blood transfusions, safer surgical techniques, and better prenatal care caused maternal mortality rates to decline dramatically across much of the world throughout the past century. In many countries, the risk of dying from childbirth-related causes fell to a small fraction of what it had been just a few generations earlier. A genuinely remarkable public health achievement built through decades of accumulated medical knowledge and improved access to care. Yet this progress has not been distributed evenly, and significant disparities remain both between different countries and notably within countries themselves. Even in nations with generally strong healthcare systems, researchers have documented persistent gaps in maternal mortality rates, along lines of income geography and race gaps that suggest access to quality care, rather than medical knowledge alone, remains a significant limiting factor. Modern childbirth is undeniably far safer than it was even 100 years ago, an achievement worth genuine appreciation. But framing it as a fully solved problem would overlook the women today who still face meaningfully elevated risk, often due to circumstances entirely outside their own control. This mixture of genuine progress, alongside persistent inequality, captures something important about the larger story of maternal sacrifice, that even as science continues advancing, the distribution of its benefits does not always advance quite as evenly, leaving some mothers still facing a version of the very same risk that shaped so much of human history before them. If safety in childbirth were simply a matter of modern medical knowledge existing somewhere in the world, the story might end on a fully reassuring note. But access to that knowledge in practice varies enormously depending entirely on where a woman happens to live and what resources are available to her. Global health data consistently shows dramatic differences in maternal mortality rates between countries with strong healthcare infrastructure and those without, differences that can span many multiples in relative risk between one region and another. Even within a single country, researchers frequently document significant disparities between urban and rural areas, where access to hospitals, trained medical staff, and emergency care can differ substantially sometimes, determining outcomes in situations where minutes genuinely matter. This is not simply a matter of wealth alone, since certain systemic and structural factors have been shown to influence outcomes independently of income level patterns. Researchers continue studying closely to better understand their underlying causes. What this reveals, taken as a whole, is that the risk a mother faces during childbirth today depends heavily on circumstances she often did not choose and frequently cannot control: her location, her access to transportation, the resources of her local healthcare system. It is a sobering reminder that while collective human knowledge has advanced enormously, that knowledge alone does not automatically translate into safety for every mother equally. Somewhere in the world tonight, a woman is giving birth with access to extraordinary medical support, while somewhere else another woman faces the very same moment with almost none of it, a gap in circumstance rather than in courage that continues to shape outcomes in ways still worth far more attention than they typically receive. It is easy to think of caregiving primarily in terms of time or emotional energy, but there is a purely physical cost to it as well, one that rarely gets acknowledged in those terms. Studies estimating the physical demands of intensive infant care, lifting, carrying, walking a fussy baby for extended periods, along with the metabolic demands of breastfeeding, have found that a mother's total daily energy expenditure during this period can be considerably higher than her pre-pregnancy baseline. On particularly demanding days, involving significant carrying and walking, combined with active breastfeeding, the additional caloric expenditure can reach a level comparable to what a moderately active adult might burn through a substantial portion of deliberate daily exercise. This is not typically framed as physical labor in the way a job requiring manual work might be, since it happens in the context of a home rather than a workplace, often while simultaneously managing sleep deprivation and interrupted rest. Yet physiologically, the body does not distinguish between exertion that occurs in a gym and exertion that occurs while pacing a hallway at 2 a.m. with a crying infant. Researchers who study postpartum physical recovery note that many new mothers are quite literally engaged in sustained physical exertion for much of their waking day, layered directly on top of a body still recovering from the physical demands of childbirth itself. It is a form of labor easy to overlook precisely because it does not resemble traditional exercise or traditional work, wearing instead the quiet, ordinary disguise of simply caring for a child when in fact measured honestly. It asks a genuinely significant amount from the body, hour after hour, day after day. Among the many physical demands of new motherhood, breastfeeding stands out as a particularly striking example of hidden exertion, one that occurs while a mother is often sitting still, appearing from the outside to be simply resting. Physiological research estimates that breastfeeding can require several hundred additional calories per day to sustain adequate milk production, an energy cost roughly comparable to running a significant distance depending on a mother's size and metabolism. This demand does not pause for a single day, continuing consistently for as long as breastfeeding continues, which for many mothers extends across many months, sometimes more than a year. What makes this particular form of exertion unusual is how invisible it appears. Since a mother nursing her infant looks to any outside observer like she is simply sitting quietly, perhaps even resting. Internally, however, her body is engaged in continuous metabolically demanding tissue production, converting nutrients from her own body into a complete, precisely balanced food source for another human being. This helps explain why many breastfeeding mothers report significant hunger and fatigue sensations that are not imagined or exaggerated, but reflect a real and substantial physiological cost occurring beneath an entirely calm surface. It is a quiet reminder that some of the most demanding work a body performs leaves no visible sign at all, no sweat, no elevated breathing. Nothing that would suggest to anyone watching that real and sustained physical effort is taking place hour after hour, feeding after feeding, entirely out of view. If you were to search historical economic records across many centuries and civilizations for a formal accounting of caregiving labor work performed almost entirely by women within households, you would find remarkably little. Historians and economists studying the history of labor have noted that caregiving and domestic work were for most of recorded history excluded from formal economic record-keeping, almost entirely treated as a natural extension of womanhood rather than as labor deserving of measurement or compensation. This pattern held true across dramatically different cultures, economic systems, and historical periods, suggesting the omission was not incidental to any one particular society, but something closer to a nearly universal blind spot in how human societies chose to define and measure productive work. Even as formal economic systems grew increasingly sophisticated, tracking trade, agriculture, and eventually industrial output, with considerable precision, caregiving work performed within the home remained largely outside that same careful accounting, an omission that persisted well into the modern era. Some economic historians argue this exclusion was not simply an oversight, but reflected deeper assumptions about whose labor was considered valuable enough to formally measure in the first place. This long historical pattern helps explain why even today, unpaid caregiving remains largely absent from how modern economies calculate productivity and growth, a gap with centuries of precedent behind it, rather than a recent oversight. It is a striking thing to consider that across such an enormous span of human history and such varied societies, one particular category of essential labor managed to remain almost entirely uncounted, hidden in plain sight, inside nearly every household in nearly every era. Modern nations rely heavily on a measurement called gross domestic product to describe the overall health and size of their economies, yet this widely used figure contains a significant and rarely discussed gap. Economists have long noted that gross domestic product, as conventionally calculated, excludes unpaid household labor almost entirely, counting a meal purchased at a restaurant as economic activity, while the very same meal prepared at home by a mother contributes nothing at all to the official figures. This exclusion applies broadly across nearly all domestic labor, childcare, cleaning, cooking, household management, work performed overwhelmingly in most studied societies by women and specifically by mothers. Some economists have attempted to calculate what is sometimes called a satellite account, an alternative measure that assigns estimated monetary value to unpaid household work, and these calculations consistently reveal figures large enough to meaningfully shift a nation's overall economic picture if included in standard reporting. Despite this, satellite accounts remain a supplementary, largely optional measure in most countries, rather than being integrated into primary economic statistics used to guide policy decisions. This has real consequences beyond simple accounting, since policies related to taxation, retirement benefits, and social support are often shaped by economic frameworks that implicitly treat unpaid caregiving as economically invisible. A mother managing a household full-time may, by these conventional measures, appear to contribute nothing to her nation's economy, despite performing work that would cost a substantial sum to replace with paid labor. It is a striking gap between lived reality and official measurement, one that continues shaping economic and policy decisions in ways still not fully reckoned with. Beyond the physical tasks of caregiving, researchers have increasingly turned their attention to a different, less visible form of labor, one involving planning, remembering, and anticipating needs before they become urgent. Studies examining household labor division have found that even in households where physical tasks are shared relatively evenly, the responsibility for tracking scheduling and anticipating a family's needs, doctor's appointments, school events, supplies running low, tends to fall disproportionately on one parent, most often the mother. This form of labor is considerably harder to observe or measure than physical tasks like cooking or cleaning, since it occurs largely inside a person's mind, running continuously in the background of daily life, rather than appearing as a discrete, visible action. Researchers studying this phenomenon note that it often continues even during moments that appear from the outside to be fully restful, since the mental tracking rarely pauses simply because the body is resting. This can create a particular kind of fatigue, distinct from physical tiredness, a sense of being perpetually responsible for remembering details that, if forgotten, could have real consequences for the family's functioning. Many parents who carry this responsibility describe difficulty fully relaxing, even during genuine downtime, because some part of their attention remains quietly allocated to tracking an ongoing mental list that never fully empties. It is a form of labor easy to overlook precisely because it produces no visible output of its own, no clean dishes, no finished laundry, only the quiet, continuous prevention of problems that, thanks to that very effort, never end up needing to be noticed at all. This particular form of invisible labor has become significant enough and common enough that sociologists have given it a specific name, the mental load sometimes also referred to as cognitive labor. The term gained wider public recognition, partly through a widely shared comic illustrating the concept, though the underlying pattern it described had already been studied by sociologists for considerably longer under various related names. Researchers define the mental load as the ongoing cognitive work of anticipating needs, making decisions, and coordinating logistics for a household work that is distinct from simply performing physical tasks themselves. What makes this concept particularly useful is that it captures something many people, especially mothers, had long experienced, but struggled to fully articulate: a persistent background awareness of responsibility that does not switch off, even during moments of physical rest. Sociological studies applying this framework have found that the mental load tends to be distributed even more unevenly between partners than physical household tasks are, since it remains largely invisible and therefore difficult to formally recognize, discuss, or divide in practical terms. This invisibility creates a particular challenge, since a task that is never seen is a task that is rarely acknowledged, and a burden that goes unacknowledged is one that is rarely shared, no matter how genuinely willing a partner might otherwise be. Naming this pattern precisely has allowed researchers and increasingly many households themselves to begin discussing something that had previously existed only as a vague, hard-to-articulate sense of persistent underlying fatigue, giving language finally to an experience that many mothers had quietly carried for a very long time without ever having quite the right words to describe it. Carrying this kind of continuous, unseen responsibility does not appear to be cost-free, even when it produces no dramatic or immediately visible symptoms. Research examining the mental load has found associations between this particular form of cognitive labor and elevated levels of chronic stress, distinct from the more acute stress associated with specific identifiable events. This is significant because chronic low-grade stress, the kind that persists quietly in the background, rather than arriving in sharp, obvious spikes, has been linked in broader medical research to a range of long-term health effects, including impacts on cardiovascular health, immune function, and overall physical resilience over time. Unlike an acute stressor, which the body can typically recover from, once it passes, chronic stress, tied to ongoing responsibility, rarely offers a clear, defined endpoint, since the underlying source of that stress, the continuous mental tracking of a household's needs, simply does not stop. Researchers studying mothers carrying a significant mental load often describe a particular kind of fatigue that persists even after adequate physical rest, since the underlying cognitive vigilance driving the stress response continues, largely uninterrupted. This helps explain a pattern many mothers report but struggle to fully articulate. Feeling tired, in a way that a good night's sleep alone does not seem to fully resolve. It is a quiet, cumulative cost, unfolding slowly across months and years, rather than announcing itself all at once, embedded so deeply into the ordinary rhythm of daily responsibility that it can become almost invisible even to the person carrying it, simply absorbed into what feels by then like an unremarkable permanent version of normal. There is a curious pattern found in human biology that sets our species apart from most others, one connected directly to the role grandmothers have historically played in raising children. Unlike most mammals, human females typically live for decades beyond the end of their reproductive years, a pattern that puzzled evolutionary biologists for some time since. In most species, individuals rarely survive much beyond their capacity to reproduce. One influential explanation, often called the grandmother hypothesis, suggests that this extended post-reproductive lifespan evolved specifically because older women who helped care for grandchildren improved those children's chances of survival, providing an evolutionary advantage significant enough to favor longer overall female lifespans across generations. Supporting evidence for this idea comes partly from studies of certain traditional societies where researchers have documented that children with actively involved grandmothers, particularly maternal grandmothers, often showed improved survival rates and nutritional outcomes compared to children without that additional support. This suggests that caregiving, far from being incidental to human evolution, may have played a direct and measurable role in shaping some of our species' most distinctive biological traits, including how long women specifically tend to live beyond their own childbearing years. It is a striking thought that the willingness of one generation of women to continue caregiving well beyond their own reproductive years may have helped shape, quite literally, the biological timeline of human female longevity itself, pattern of care so evolutionarily significant that it appears to be written directly into human lifespan itself, extending forward across countless generations. There is a specific term evolutionary biologists use to describe why a mother's caregiving does not simply stop once her own children are grown, a concept called parental investment extended here across an additional generation. The underlying logic is elegant in its simplicity. A grandmother who helps ensure her grandchildren survive and thrive is, in evolutionary terms, still investing in the continuation of her own genetic line, just one step further removed than direct parenting. Researchers studying this pattern across different societies have found that this extended investment often shows up in very concrete ways. Grandmothers providing food, supervision, and knowledge that measurably improves a grandchild's chances of survival, particularly in communities facing scarce resources or difficult conditions. This does not mean the caregiving itself feels calculated or strategic to the women providing it, since from the inside, it likely feels exactly like what it is called by nearly everyone who experiences it: love plain and ordinary. But evolutionary biology offers a useful lens here, suggesting that some of the deepest, most persistent forms of care humans display may be rooted in something older than culture, older than language, woven instead into the basic biological logic of survival itself. What began as one mother's investment in one child does not simply end there. It appears to ripple forward generation after generation, each mother's care becoming part of the foundation the next generation stands on. It is a quiet kind of continuity, one you yourself are very likely a part of, whether or not you have ever thought about it in quite these terms before tonight. Think back for a moment over everything covered so far tonight. The hours, the lost sleep, the trillions of dollars in labor that never shows up in a single national account, the wage gaps that widen quietly year after year. None of it required grand gestures. All of it happened through small, repeated acts, so consistent and so ordinary that they rarely registered as anything worth recording at all. This is in a way the strange arithmetic of motherhood, an entire category of human effort, measured carefully by researchers and almost never measured at all by the systems meant to track what a society values. No formal ledger exists for a night spent pacing a hallway with a feverish child. No line item captures a career quietly redirected year after year to make room for someone else's needs. And yet, if you think honestly about your own life, some version of this labor almost certainly shaped it, whether you have ever paused to name it or not. Somewhere behind the ordinary architecture of your own childhood, someone was almost certainly doing this exact kind of uncounted, unglamorous work on your behalf, quietly, consistently, without expecting it to ever be tallied or repaid. That is where we turn our attention now, away from the scale of it, and toward something smaller and closer. Not statistics anymore, but you specifically, and the particular personal ways this invisible labor may have already touched your own life, long before you ever had a name for it. Somewhere in your very first months of life, in a moment you will never consciously remember, someone almost certainly held you and moved gently back and forth until your crying softened and your body finally relaxed into sleep. You have no access to this memory. The part of the brain responsible for forming long-term retrievable memories was not yet developed enough at that age to preserve it. And yet it happened likely many hundreds of times, this small repeated act of comfort offered to a version of you too young to ever thank anyone for it, or even to know later that it had occurred at all. There is something worth sitting with in that thought. An enormous amount of care was extended toward you before you had any capacity to appreciate it, to reciprocate it, or even to remember that it took place. It simply happened night after night, quietly enough that it left no trace in your own memory, only in your body's early experience of what safety and comfort felt like. Researchers who study infant attachment note that these earliest unremembered experiences of being soothed often shape a person's later capacity to feel calm, to trust. to settle into rest even decades afterward. In a very real sense, some of your own present-day ability to relax, to feel safe enough to close your eyes and drift towards sleep right now, may trace back to those forgotten early nights rocked gently by someone whose face you cannot picture from that time, whose voice you cannot specifically recall, but whose care, in some quiet, wordless way, is still present in you. We spoke earlier about how a mother's brain learns to recognize her infant's specific cry with unusual speed and precision, distinguishing it from the cries of other babies entirely. Now consider this fact, turned toward you directly. At some point in your own infancy, someone learned the particular sound of your voice this way. Its pitch, its rhythm. The subtle difference between your hungry cry and your tired one committed to memory, not through conscious study, but through repeated, attentive presence. This is a strange thing to consider, that you once had a voice entirely unlike your current one, communicated only through crying, and that voice was for a time deeply familiar to someone else. More familiar perhaps than it ever became to you, since none of us remember our own infant sounds. That particular cry no longer exists. Your voice has changed many times since then, shaped by growth, by age, by every year that has passed between that early version of you and the person reading or listening to these words right now. But for a brief window of time, it was significant enough, specific enough that someone learned to recognize it instantly, even from another room, even from sleep. It is a small, easily overlooked kind of intimacy. This early wordless fluency someone once had in the particular language of your own infant voice. A fluency that existed only briefly and only for you, before it quietly faded its purpose. Complete. Once you no longer needed it to be understood. For a long time, developmental psychology focused heavily on the stages a child moves through: infancy, childhood, adolescence, treating adulthood largely as a single stable phase, without much further internal structure. More recently, researchers have begun paying closer attention to a distinct psychological transition many women experience upon becoming mothers. A shift substantial enough that some psychologists now treat it as its own developmental stage, entirely comparable in its intensity and reorganization to earlier life transitions like adolescence. This period involves significant changes, not just in daily routine, but in identity itself. How a woman understands who she is, what she values, and how she relates to her own body, her relationships, and her sense of purpose. Unlike more visible transitions, this particular one often unfolds with very little formal acknowledgement or support, expected to happen quietly and successfully, without much explicit guidance, even though it represents one of the more significant psychological reorganizations a person can experience. Researchers studying this transition have found that women often report feeling caught off guard by its intensity, having anticipated the practical demands of caring for an infant, but not necessarily the deeper, more disorienting shift happening within their own sense of self at the very same time. It is a quiet kind of upheaval, rarely discussed with the seriousness it deserves, happening alongside and sometimes overshadowed entirely by the more visible demands of caring for a newborn. Even though something just as significant is unfolding within the mother herself during this same tender, disorienting window of time. The specific term for this psychological transition into motherhood is matrescence, a word coined decades ago by an anthropologist studying the profound identity shifts new mothers experience, though the term has only gained wider recognition in recent years. Much like adolescence, matrescence involves significant hormonal shifts, changes in social role, and a fundamental renegotiation of identity, all happening simultaneously, often within a remarkably compressed period of time. Researchers studying matrescence have found that women frequently report feelings of confusion, loss, and disorientation during this transition, alongside the more commonly discussed feelings of joy and connection. a combination that can feel contradictory and difficult to fully articulate even to oneself. Unlike adolescence, however, matrescence typically unfolds with minimal cultural acknowledgement, few rites of passage, and little formal preparation, despite involving comparable levels of psychological and physical transformation. Many new mothers describe feeling as though they should already know how to navigate this shift, since motherhood is so often framed culturally as instinctive and natural, when in reality, the internal experience is frequently far more complex, more disorienting, and more genuinely difficult than that framing suggests. Naming this transition explicitly, giving it a real term rooted in psychological research, rather than leaving it as a vague, unspoken feeling, appears to help many women make sense of an experience that otherwise can feel isolating and confusing to go through alone. If someone in your own life has moved through this particular season, whether recently or many years ago, it is worth considering that she likely navigated something genuinely significant, a real developmental transition, even if no one around her ever gave it quite this name. Alongside the joy so often associated with new motherhood, researchers have documented a less openly discussed emotional experience, a quiet sense of grief connected to the loss of a former identity, one that existed before a child arrived, and reshaped nearly every aspect of daily life. This grief does not typically indicate regret about having a child, and researchers are careful to distinguish it clearly from that. Instead, it reflects something more specific, mourning the loss of a particular version of independence, spontaneity, or personal identity that simply cannot coexist in quite the same form, alongside the intense, ongoing demand. Infant. Many mothers report feeling uncomfortable, even acknowledging this grief, worried that expressing it might be misunderstood as ingratitude or as a lack of love for their child, when in reality, psychologists note that the two feelings, grief for an old self and genuine love for a new child, can and often do exist simultaneously without contradiction. This particular form of quiet mourning often goes entirely unspoken, tucked away privately, rarely shared even with close friends or partners, since there are few accepted scripts for expressing it openly within most cultural conversations about motherhood. If you have a mother in your own life, there is a real possibility that somewhere within her own experience of early motherhood, she quietly carried some version of this grief as well, a private, complicated feeling she may never have found the right words or the right moment to fully share with you. It is worth pausing specifically on this idea, since it runs counter to how many people instinctively imagine emotion is supposed to work, as though feelings must be singular and consistent, rather than layered, and sometimes contradictory. Psychologists who study the emotional experience of new motherhood emphasize that grief over a lost former identity and deep, genuine love for a new child are not opposing forces competing for space within the same person. They can, and very often do, exist together simultaneously without one diminishing the authenticity of the other in any way. A mother can love her child completely, and in the very same week, in the very same afternoon, quietly miss the version of herself that existed before that child arrived, missing the freedom, the spontaneity, or simply the familiar sense of her own former identity. This coexistence is not a sign of ambivalence or insufficient love, despite how easily it might be misread that way, either by others or by the mother herself, in moments of self-doubt. Rather, it reflects something genuinely human, the mind's capacity to hold complex, layered emotional truths at the very same time, without needing to resolve them into a single, simpler feeling. If this idea resonates with something you have witnessed or perhaps even experienced yourself, know that it reflects an entirely normal, well-documented emotional pattern, not any kind of failure. Somewhere quietly, many mothers carry both of these truths at once, love and grief, side by side, never fully separate, never fully in conflict, simply two honest parts of the very same complicated, tender experience. Somewhere in your first weeks of life, someone in your household was likely engaged in a quiet, unspoken process of learning to translate you, listening closely enough, repeatedly enough, to begin telling apart the subtle differences between your various cries. Researchers who study infant communication have found that cries genuinely do differ in acoustic pattern depending on their cause: hunger, discomfort, fatigue, and that caregivers who spend significant time with a particular infant often become measurably skilled at distinguishing between them, sometimes with notable accuracy. This is a learned skill, not an automatic one, built gradually through repeated attentive exposure rather than arriving instantly or intuitively. It requires a particular kind of sustained attention, the willingness to keep listening carefully, even at 3 a.m, even after the 10th cry of the night, gradually building a kind of fluency in a language that has no words, only sound, only tone, only the small variations a tired but attentive ear eventually learns to catch. You have no memory of this process since it occurred before your own memory had developed enough to record it. But someone somewhere was doing this quiet work on your behalf, learning you one cry at a time long before you could offer any other way of being understood. It is easy to overlook a skill that leaves no visible trace, no certificate, no formal recognition. Yet this particular fluency, however invisible, however unrecorded, was very likely once devoted specifically and patiently to you, built through nothing more than repeated presence and a willingness to keep listening. Infants do not arrive with any concept of night and day, their sleep occurring in short, unpredictable bursts scattered somewhat randomly across a full 24-hour period, a pattern that typically takes months to gradually align with a more conventional day-night rhythm. During this period, the adult caring most closely for that infant, very often the mother, frequently finds her own sleep schedule reorganized entirely around this unpredictable pattern, waking at whatever hours the baby wakes, rather than following any schedule of her own choosing. This is not simply an inconvenience experienced for a few difficult nights. Sleep researchers note that this disrupted pattern can persist for months, sometimes over a year, depending on how quickly a particular infant's sleep naturally consolidates into longer, more predictable stretches. During your own infancy, whoever cared for you most closely through the night likely experienced some version of this. A sleep schedule, dictated not by her own body's natural rhythm, but by yours, adjusting again and again to whatever pattern you happen to settle into on any given week. This kind of sustained schedule disruption is known to affect mood, cognitive function, and physical health, yet it is rarely discussed as a significant sacrifice in its own right, treated instead as simply an unremarkable expected part of caring for a young infant. If you have ever wondered why early photographs from your infancy often show visible exhaustion in the adults around you, this is very likely at least part of the reason: an entire sleep schedule quietly rebuilt night after night around the place. Unpredictable rhythm of someone too small yet to know just how much that rebuilding cost. There is a small, almost comic detail that surveys of new parents return to again and again: the phenomenon of the perpetually cold meal reheated 3 or 4 times, or simply abandoned entirely and eaten cold because reheating it once more felt like more effort than it was worth. Parenting surveys have found this to be a remarkably common experience among mothers of young children. Eating interrupted repeatedly by a child's needs, until the meal itself becomes, almost incidentally, a cold secondary afterthought to whatever task actually demanded attention in that moment. This detail is small enough to seem trivial, hardly worth mentioning, alongside larger sacrifices like lost career opportunities or disrupted sleep. Yet it captures something quietly telling about how thoroughly a mother's own basic needs can become deprioritized amid the countless smaller demands of caregiving so consistently that eating a warm meal, an experience most people take entirely for granted, can become something genuinely rare. During certain seasons of early motherhood, It is rarely framed as a sacrifice in any serious sense, since it seems too minor, too mundane to warrant real attention. But multiplied across thousands of meals over months and years, this small repeated pattern reflects something larger, a habit of self-postponement, so consistent it eventually stops registering as unusual at all, simply becoming the ordinary expected texture of daily life. If you ever noticed growing up that the adult feeding you rarely seemed to actually sit down and eat alongside you, there is a reasonable chance this particular quietly persistent pattern was at least part of the reason why. What makes this kind of self-postponement particularly striking is not any single instance of it, but rather how completely it can become normalized over time, until it no longer registers even to the person experiencing it as any kind of sacrifice at all. Researchers studying caregiver behavior have observed that repeated patterns of self-postponement, delayed meals, interrupted rest, deferred personal needs tend to become deeply habitual, absorbed so thoroughly into daily routine that they eventually stop being consciously noticed or named as a cost. This creates a particular kind of invisibility different from the more measurable statistical invisibility of unpaid labor discussed earlier. This is a psychological invisibility occurring within the mother's own awareness, a habit so consistently reinforced that it no longer registers internally as something being given up simply as how things are. Psychologists note that this kind of normalized self-postponement can make it genuinely difficult for mothers to identify their own needs clearly, even when directly asked, since the habit of deferring those needs has become so deeply powerful, automatic, over months and years. This pattern can quietly reshape a person's relationship with their own basic needs entirely, making rest, nourishment, and personal time feel less like reasonable expectations and more like occasional, almost undeserved luxuries. It is worth naming this pattern clearly here, precisely because it so rarely gets named within the mother's own daily experience. This quiet, cumulative habit of setting herself aside again and again, until doing so simply stops feeling like a choice at all, and starts feeling instead like an unremarkable permanent version of who she has become. The human body's stress response system, involving hormones like cortisol, is designed primarily for short-term activation, responding to an immediate threat, and then returning to baseline once that threat has passed. Research on chronic caregiving, however, has found something notably different among many mothers of young children, a stress response that remains mildly elevated for extended periods, sometimes persisting across years rather than resolving between individual stressful moments. This differs meaningfully from the kind of acute stress most people associate with the term a sudden spike followed by recovery, and instead resembles something closer to a sustained, low-level activation that never fully returns to its original baseline throughout much of the caregiving period. Researchers studying this pattern note that it likely reflects the genuinely continuous nature of caregiving responsibility itself, since unlike most stressors, which eventually resolve or pass, the underlying demands of caring for young children remain relatively constant for years, at a stretch, offering few clear opportunities for the stress response system to fully reset. This sustained elevation has been associated in broader research with various long-term health effects, though scientists continue studying the precise mechanisms and consequences involved. What is clear is that this is not simply a subjective feeling of being stressed, but a measurable physiological pattern, detectable through hormonal testing, reflecting real and sustained demands placed on the body over an extended period. If someone cared for you through your own early childhood, there is a real possibility her body carried this quiet, sustained physiological cost for years, largely unnoticed, simply part of what caring for you actually required of her, at a level far deeper than conscious awareness alone. Given everything covered so far, the lost sleep, the elevated stress, the quiet grief and physical toll, It would be reasonable to assume that mothers might describe early parenthood primarily in difficult, exhausted terms. Yet research consistently finds something more complicated and in many ways more hopeful than that assumption would suggest. When asked directly, mothers overwhelmingly report specific ordinary moments, a particular laugh, a small hand reaching for theirs, a quiet moment of connection during an otherwise exhausting day, as sources of genuine significant joy, even amid substantial fatigue and difficulty. Psychologists studying parental well-being describe this as a kind of coexistence rather than a contradiction. Difficulty and joy occurring not in separate sequential phases, but woven together within the very same days, sometimes within the very same hour. This helps explain a pattern many people find puzzling from the outside: why someone might describe a particular season of their life as simultaneously the hardest and among the most meaningful they have ever experienced, that seem, on the surface, difficult to fully reconcile. Researchers suggest this reflects something genuinely true about how meaning and difficulty often relate to one another, that some of the most demanding experiences a person undergoes can at the very same time become the ones that feel most significant and most worth having lived through. If someone cared for you through your own early years, it is worth considering that even amid whatever exhaustion and sacrifice she carried, she likely also experienced real, specific moments of genuine joy, connected directly to caring for you, moments that, however small, mattered to her far more than she may have ever fully expressed. There is a specific physical sensation that many mothers describe with striking consistency: the particular weight and warmth of a sleeping child settled against their chest or shoulder, a sensation that seems to leave an unusually durable impression in memory even decades later. Researchers studying sensory memory suggest that this durability may relate to how deeply certain physical sensations become associated with strong emotional states. In this case, the combination of physical closeness, protective instinct, quiet calm that often accompanies holding a sleeping child. Many mothers of grown children report being able to recall this specific sensation with unusual clarity, describing it almost as though their body itself retained a kind of physical memory separate from and more vivid than an ordinary visual recollection. This is notable because most physical sensations tend to fade relatively quickly from memory, replaced or overwritten by countless subsequent similar experiences. Yet this particular sensation, the specific weight of one's own child asleep against one's body, appears to remain unusually vivid and specific, even long after that child has grown into an adult who no longer fits in any literal sense in quite that same way. If you were ever held this way as a small child, sound asleep, unaware, there is a real possibility that the person holding you still carries some version of that exact physical memory, still able to recall with surprising clarity precisely how it felt to hold you back when you were small enough to be held so completely and so easily. A single sock, a first drawing, a small plastic toy, long since replaced by better ones. If you were to look carefully through your own mother's belongings, there is a reasonable chance you would find some small, seemingly insignificant object connected to your childhood, kept for reasons she may never have fully explained, even to herself. Researchers studying memory and object attachment describe this pattern as common among parents: the preservation of specific, often unremarkable items that become quietly imbued with significance far beyond their practical or material value, functioning less as objects and more as physical anchors to a particular memory or moment in time. These objects are rarely chosen for any obvious reason, not necessarily the most expensive gift or the most dramatic milestone, but often something small and ordinary that happened to be present during a moment that mattered emotionally, even if the reason it mattered was never consciously articulated at the time. Psychologists suggest that these kept objects serve a specific emotional function, offering a tangible, physical connection to a period of time that otherwise exists only in memory, increasingly fragile and prone to fading as years pass. A mother might not be able to fully explain why she has kept a particular small item from your childhood for so long, only that something in her resisted letting it go, some quiet instinct insisting it mattered, even after its obvious usefulness had long since passed. If you were to ask, you might find she has kept more of these small objects than you ever realized, each one a small private monument to a moment she did not want to lose entirely, even if she never quite found the words to explain why to anyone, including herself. There is a curious asymmetry that researchers studying memory have observed among parents, a tendency to retain remarkably vivid, detailed memories of specific childhood milestones, first steps, first words, particular moments from decades earlier, even when far more recent events from their own daily lives have already faded into vague general impressions. This is not simply nostalgia in a loose sentimental sense, but appears to reflect something more specific about how emotionally significant memories are encoded and preserved differently than ordinary routine ones. Memory researchers note that moments carrying strong emotional weight, particularly those tied to milestones in a child's development, tend to be consolidated into long-term memory, with unusual clarity and detail, sometimes remaining vivid for the rest of a person's life, while countless more recent but emotionally neutral days blur together and fade. Many mothers can describe with striking specificity the exact circumstances surrounding a child's first steps, the room, the time of day, what she herself was doing. Details from a moment that occurred years or even decades earlier, while struggling to recall clearly what happened just last week. This suggests something worth sitting with, that certain moments from your own early childhood, moments you yourself have no memory of at all, may exist with startling clarity inside someone else's mind, preserved carefully, precisely, permanently, long after your own memory of that exact same moment failed to form in the first place or faded entirely with time. Alongside vivid memories of major milestones, many mothers also retain surprisingly specific memories of small, ordinary things, particular phrases. A child used mispronounced words, small expressions unique to a specific age, details so minor they would seem unlikely to survive in memory at all, and yet frequently do, remaining recoverable even decades later. This pattern reflects something genuinely touching about how deeply attentive early caregiving tends to be, an attentiveness so consistent and so sustained that it captures details a more casual observer would likely miss or forget almost immediately. You yourself, in all likelihood, have no memory of the specific words or phrases you used as a very young child, since children rarely retain memories from that early an age with any real clarity or accuracy. Yet somewhere, if your mother is present in your life, she may still recall with surprising specificity some particular word you once mispronounced in a way she found endearing, or some small phrase you repeated often enough that it became, briefly, a kind of private language between the two of you. These small linguistic fragments, entirely lost from your own memory, may still exist clearly within hers, small pieces of a much younger version of yourself, preserved carefully in a mind that was paying closer attention in that particular moment than either of you likely realized at the time. It is a quiet kind of preservation, unglamorous and easily overlooked, yet remarkably durable. This simple fact that some small part of who you once were may still live on intact inside someone else's memory alone. There is a specific quiet ritual that researchers studying empty nest experiences have documented among many parents, particularly mothers, a tendency to return periodically to old photographs, especially ones from a child's earlier years, long after that child has grown and moved into an independent adult life. This is not necessarily a dramatic or emotionally overwhelming experience each time, but often something smaller and more habitual. A quiet moment of reflection, sometimes even unconscious, a photograph glanced at, while looking for something else and lingered over a moment longer than strictly necessary. Psychologists studying this pattern suggest it may serve as a way of maintaining continuity with an earlier, deeply significant period of a mother's own identity. A way of briefly revisiting a version of both herself and her child that no longer exists in quite the same form. This tendency often increases specifically during the transition, sometimes called empty nest, when a child moves out, and the daily structure of caregiving so central to a mother's routine for so many years changes suddenly, significantly. If you have moved out of your own childhood home, there is a real possibility that somewhere in that home, a particular photograph from your own earlier years exists in a slightly worn or faded state, having been looked at and quietly returned to far more often than you might expect. It is a small, private habit rarely mentioned aloud, yet reflecting something genuinely significant. A mother's quiet, ongoing relationship with a version of you that time has since moved beyond, but that she has clearly not entirely let go of. Alongside the joy and connection so often associated with new motherhood, a significant number of women experience a genuine, clinically recognized mental health condition called postpartum depression, involving persistent sadness, anxiety, and disgrace. Exhaustion that extends well beyond the ordinary adjustment. Difficulties of early parenthood. Public health research estimates that postpartum depression affects a substantial minority of new mothers, though researchers believe the true prevalence may be somewhat higher, since many cases likely go unreported or undiagnosed due to stigma, lack of awareness, or limited access to mental health screening after childbirth. This condition is distinct from the milder, more common experience, sometimes called the baby blues, which typically resolves within a couple of weeks after birth, whereas postpartum depression can persist for months, and without appropriate support, sometimes considerably longer. Many women experiencing postpartum depression describe significant hesitation about disclosing their symptoms, worried that expressing struggle during a period so culturally associated with joy might be perceived as ingratitude, weakness, or even a sign of inadequate maternal love, despite postpartum depression being a well-documented medical condition with clear biological and hormonal contributing factors, not a reflection of a mother's character or capability. This silence has real consequences, since postpartum depression, like most medical conditions, generally responds well to appropriate treatment and support, yet treatment cannot begin if the condition remains hidden due to shame or fear of judgment. If a topic this sensitive touches something in your own life or in someone you love, it is worth remembering that struggling in this particular common, medically recognized way reflects nothing about a mother's love or worth, only her humanity. There is a particular kind of silence that researchers studying postpartum mental health have documented repeatedly, a reluctance among many struggling new mothers to speak openly about what they are experiencing, rooted specifically in fear of appearing ungrateful for a child they do in fact love, deeply and completely. This fear is powerful enough that many women report concealing significant symptoms, even from their own partners, family members, and healthcare providers, worried that expressing genuine difficulty might be misread as regret insufficient, love, or personal failure, none of which accurately reflects what postpartum depression actually is. Cultural narratives surrounding motherhood often emphasize joy and gratitude so heavily that struggle can feel to many mothers like something shameful to hide, rather than something legitimate to share and address openly. Mental health researchers note that this particular fear, being perceived as an ungrateful or inadequate mother, appears to be a significant and specific barrier preventing many women from seeking help, distinct from more general stigma surrounding mental health struggles overall. This creates a difficult, isolating situation. A mother experiencing real medical symptoms, while simultaneously believing, often incorrectly, that acknowledging those symptoms would somehow betray or diminish her genuine love for her child. If someone in your own life navigated early motherhood, silently carrying some version of this particular fear, without ever fully voicing it, know that her silence very likely reflected the intensity of her love, not any lack of it, a quiet, painful irony many mothers have carried alone, for far longer than they ever needed to. For much of recent history, postpartum depression remained a largely unspoken experience, rarely discussed openly in medical settings, media, or everyday conversation, despite affecting a significant number of new mothers across generations. Public awareness and open discussion of postpartum mental health have increased considerably only within the past few decades, driven partly by advocacy from mental health professionals and notably by public figures willing to share their own experiences, candidly helping normalize a conversation that had previously remained largely hidden behind closed doors. This shift has had real, measurable effects, including increased rates of mothers seeking screening and treatment, alongside a gradual, though still incomplete, reduction in the stigma historically associated with acknowledging postpartum struggle. Yet this openness remains relatively recent, meaning many mothers from earlier generations, potentially including mothers or grandmothers within your own family, navigated this same difficult experience during a time when open conversation about it was far less available, far less socially accepted, and far less likely to lead to meaningful support. If postpartum depression touched a woman in your own family's history, whether recently or decades ago, it is worth considering that she may have carried that particular struggle during a time when speaking about it openly was simply not an available option, facing something genuinely difficult, largely alone without the language support or social permission that exists somewhat more readily today. This history matters not to dwell on it, but to recognize just how recently and how hard-won this particular shift toward openness actually was. We spoke earlier about the hormonally driven vigilance that develops during early motherhood, a heightened attentiveness to potential threats, tied closely to a newly vulnerable infant's safety. What researchers have found more recently is that this particular vigilance does not simply expire once that infant grows into an independent adult capable of caring for themselves. Studies examining parental attentiveness across the lifespan have found that many mothers continue to display measurable signs of protective concern well into their child's adulthood, long after any practical caregiving role has technically ended. This might manifest as a persistent tendency to worry disproportionately during minor illnesses, heightened concern during travel, or a lingering need to know a grown child has arrived somewhere safely, even when that child is fully capable of managing such situations independently. Psychologists studying this pattern suggest it likely reflects the same underlying neurological and hormonal foundations established during early motherhood systems that, once activated, appear to remain at least partially engaged for the remainder of a mother's life, rather than fully deactivating once their original practical purpose has passed. This can sometimes create friction within adult relationships, as a grown child seeking independence encounters a mother whose underlying vigilance has not diminished at quite the same pace as her child's growing autonomy. If your own mother still asks you to text her upon arriving somewhere safely, still worries during ordinary illnesses that no longer warrant serious concern, this persistent watchfulness likely reflects something biological and enduring. Simply habit or overprotectiveness, but the lingering, still active remnant of a vigilance first activated the moment you were born, and never fully switched off since. Earlier, we discussed how a mother's sleeping brain becomes finely attuned to recognizing her own infant's specific cry, often waking her instantly while leaving her undisturbed by other unrelated sounds. What is less commonly discussed is how long this particular sensitivity can persist, sometimes for many years beyond infancy, occasionally even into a child's adulthood. Sleep researchers studying long-term patterns in maternal sleep have found that many mothers continue to display heightened responsiveness to sounds resembling a child's cry or distress call, even when their children have long since outgrown the age where such sounds would typically occur. This might manifest as briefly waking to an unrelated sound that shares acoustic similarities with a child's cry. A reaction occurring almost instantly before conscious thought has time to recognize that the sound in question has nothing to do with her own now-grown child at all. Researchers believe this reflects deeply reinforced neural pathways, built during the intensive early years of caregiving pathways that once firmly established do not simply fade away the moment they are no longer actively needed. This lingering sensitivity is rarely something a mother consciously chooses to maintain, and often persists well beyond any point where it serves an obvious practical purpose. If your own mother has ever mentioned waking briefly at a sound that reminded her even fleetingly of you as a young child, even though you are now fully grown, this reflects a real, well-documented neurological pattern, evidence of an accent, attentiveness first built specifically for you still quietly present within her, even now so many years later. The persistence of this particular vigilance, extending years and sometimes decades beyond its original practical purpose, is not simply a matter of habit or memory in any casual sense, but appears to reflect genuine, measurable changes, brain activity, that can be observed through neuroimaging. Studies comparing brain activity in mothers of grown children to women who have never had children have found continued differences in regions associated with threat detection and emotional responsiveness, differences that persist even decades after the most intensive years of caregiving have ended. This suggests that the earlier brain changes associated with early motherhood, discussed near the beginning of tonight's exploration, are not entirely temporary adaptations that fully reverse once a child grows independent, but represent at least in part a lasting reorganization of how a mother's brain continues to process certain kinds of information for the remainder of her life. Researchers studying this long-term pattern note that this does not mean a mother's brain remains permanently locked in a state of high alert, since daily functioning clearly adapts and normalizes considerably as a child grows older. Rather, certain specific pathways, particularly related to recognizing and responding to signs of distress in her own child, appear to remain more readily accessible, more easily reactivated than equivalent pathways in someone who never experienced this particular period of early intensive caregiving. It is a quiet kind of permanence embedded directly within the physical structure of the brain itself. A reminder that some forms of care once built do not simply disappear once their original practical necessity has passed, but instead settle into something closer to a lasting structural feature of who that person has since become. The financial sacrifices associated with motherhood discussed earlier in terms of reduced career earnings do not necessarily end once a child reaches adulthood and financial independence, at least in principle. Research examining intergenerational financial support has found that many mothers continue providing meaningful financial assistance to their adult children, well beyond the point where such support might be considered strictly necessary, contributing toward education costs, housing assistance, or simply ongoing smaller forms of financial help extended quietly and consistently over many years. This pattern often continues, even when it requires real sacrifice on the mother's own part, sometimes delaying her own retirement savings or personal financial security in order to continue supporting an adult child navigating early career instability, educational expenses, or other significant life transitions. Financial researchers studying this pattern note that this kind of support is rarely framed by mothers themselves as sacrifice in any dramatic sense, but rather as simply an ordinary expected continuation of a caregiving role that in their own understanding has never entirely ended, regardless of a child's technical, legal, or financial independence. This creates a quiet continuation of the earlier lifelong earnings gap discussed previously. A mother who already sacrificed meaningful career earnings during her child's early years, sometimes continuing to sacrifice additional financial security well into her own later years in order to keep supporting that same child, now grown but not always entirely independent. If your own mother has ever quietly offered financial help beyond what felt strictly necessary, this reflects a well-documented common pattern. One more example of sacrifice extended long after most people would assume a mother's primary caregiving obligations had already concluded. Health researchers studying maternal well-being have identified a consistent and concerning pattern: mothers frequently delaying or foregoing their own necessary medical care, choosing instead to prioritize their children's health needs, scheduling conflicts and appointments ahead of their own. This pattern has been documented across numerous studies examining healthcare utilization among parents, particularly mothers who often report postponing their own checkups, screenings, or even treatment for existing health concerns due to the practical and logistical challenges of managing both caregiving responsibilities and their own healthcare needs simultaneously. This delay is rarely a single dramatic decision, but rather accumulates gradually through countless smaller choices, made repeatedly over months and years. A missed checkup here, a postponed screening there, each individually seeming minor, but collectively representing a significant pattern of self-neglect regarding personal health. Researchers studying this phenomenon note that this pattern can have real, sometimes serious health consequences over time, since many treatable conditions become considerably more difficult to manage effectively when diagnosis and treatment are delayed for extended periods due to competing caregiving priorities. This behavior is rarely framed by mothers themselves as neglecting their own health in any deliberate sense, but rather experienced simply as an ordinary, almost invisible byproduct of prioritizing a child's needs above her own, a pattern so consistently reinforced that it often does not register as a conscious sacrifice at all. If your own mother has ever postponed her own doctor's appointment, specifically because of something related to your own health or schedule, this reflects a genuinely common, well-documented pattern. One more example of a sacrifice made so quietly, so routinely, that it likely never once felt to her like something worth mentioning aloud. What makes this particular pattern of health-related self-neglect especially notable is how consistently researchers have found it across a wide range of income levels and socioeconomic backgrounds, suggesting the underlying cause is not simply a matter of limited financial resources or inadequate healthcare access alone. Even among mothers with excellent healthcare coverage and considerable financial resources, researchers have documented similar patterns of delayed or foregone personal medical care, driven less by practical barriers and more by deeply ingrained habits of prioritizing a child's needs, automatically, almost reflexively, above their own. This suggests something more deeply structural at work, a pattern of self-postponement so consistently reinforced across a mother's daily life that it appears to become somewhat independent of the practical logistical barriers that might otherwise explain it in isolation. Researchers studying this consistency across income levels suggest it may reflect broader cultural expectations surrounding motherhood itself, expectations that frame maternal self-sacrifice as not simply practical necessity, but as an implicit marker of good, appropriately devoted mothering, regardless of whether such sacrifice is actually necessary in any given specific 2T circumstance. This creates a particularly difficult pattern to address through practical solutions alone, since even mothers with abundant resources and genuine access to care often still delay their own health needs, suggesting the underlying habit runs considerably deeper than simple logistics or financial limitation. It is a sobering pattern, this consistency, across such different life circumstances, suggesting that somewhere within the broader cultural understanding of what a good mother is expected to do, self-postponement itself has quietly become an unspoken expectation, one carried by mothers across every level of income, opportunity, alike. Alongside career and health-related sacrifices, researchers studying social relationships have documented a further less discussed pattern, a measurable contraction in many mothers' social networks and friendships during the most intensive years of early caregiving. Studies tracking social connection over time have found that new mothers often experience a significant reduction in the frequency of contact with friends, alongside a general narrowing of their broader social circle changes, driven largely by the substantial time and energy demands of caring for young children, which leave considerably less availability for maintaining relationships outside the immediate family. This reduction is rarely a deliberate choice to withdraw from friendships, but rather an unintended consequence of simply having less time, less energy, and less flexibility than before, particularly for friendships that require significant coordination or that existed primarily around activities no longer compatible with caring for a young child. Researchers note that this social contraction can be particularly pronounced for friendships formed before motherhood with people who do not have children themselves, since the daily rhythms and available time between mothers and non-parent friends often diverge substantially during this particular life stage. Over time, some of these friendships fade entirely quietly without any specific conflict or falling out, simply worn away gradually by diverging schedules and diminishing opportunities for the kind of regular contact that sustains most friendships over the long term. It is a quiet, largely unintentional cost, rarely framed explicitly as a sacrifice, yet representing a genuine loss nonetheless. Entire relationships that once mattered considerably, gradually receding into the background during the very years when a mother's own need for outside connection and support may have actually been at its highest. Building directly on this pattern of shrinking friendships, researchers studying maternal well-being have found that genuine social isolation, not simply a reduced number of friends, but a real felt sense of disconnection and loneliness, is remarkably common during the early years of motherhood, despite receiving relatively little public discussion compared to other, more visible challenges of new parenthood. Surveys of new mothers frequently report significant feelings of loneliness, even among women who are by any outward measure surrounded by family and rarely physically alone, suggesting that this particular isolation is less about literal solitude and more about a felt absence of adult connection, conversation, and mutual understanding during a period defined largely by the singular repetitive demands of caring for a young child. This isolation is often compounded by the mismatch discussed earlier, since friendships with people who do not share the same daily caregiving reality can begin to feel increasingly difficult to sustain in any meaningful way, leaving many new mothers without an easy, natural source of the kind of peer connection they may have previously relied on. Mental health researchers note that this isolation can be a significant contributing factor to broader struggles during early motherhood, including elevated stress and vulnerability to postpartum depression. Yet it remains an experience many mothers hesitate to name directly, worried that expressing loneliness while caring for a deeply wanted child might seem contradictory or ungrateful. This particular struggle, quiet and largely unspoken, has likely touched more mothers than most people realize, including possibly someone in your own life who may have navigated a genuinely isolating period during your own early childhood, largely alone, without ever fully naming it as isolation at all. There is a particular contradiction that researchers studying maternal identity have documented repeatedly, a sense many mothers describe of being simultaneously indispensable and unseen, absolutely essential to the daily functioning of their household, while also feeling at the very same time curiously invisible within it. This contradiction often centers specifically on the kind of invisible labor discussed earlier, the mental load, the anticipatory planning, the countless small tasks performed so consistently and so quietly that they become nearly impossible for others in the household to fully notice or appreciate, precisely because they are performed so effectively that no visible problem ever arises to draw attention to the effort behind preventing it. A mother whose careful planning ensures a smooth, uneventful week may paradoxically receive less visible acknowledgement than she would if something had actually gone wrong, since the absence of a problem rarely calls attention to the considerable effort required to prevent it in the first place. Psychologists studying this pattern describe it as a particular kind of loneliness, distinct from social isolation, a feeling of being surrounded by the very people she cares for most deeply, while still feeling in some fundamental sense unseen by them. Her contributions so seamlessly integrated into daily life that they become almost invisible even to the people benefiting most directly from them. If you have ever lived in a household that simply seemed to run smoothly, meals appearing schedules, coordinating small problems quietly resolved before they became large ones, it is worth considering how much quiet, largely unacknowledged effort that smoothness likely required, and how invisible that particular effort may have felt to the person providing it. There is a particular kind of quiet preparation many mothers engage in before difficult conversations with their children, a private rehearsal, sometimes conducted alone, sometimes with a partner or friend working through exactly how to best phrase something sensitive or difficult before ever actually saying it aloud to the child it concerns. Researchers studying parental communication have found that mothers frequently report considerable anticipatory effort before delivering difficult news or having challenging conversations with their children, carefully considering word choice, timing, and tone in advance, driven by a genuine desire to communicate something true while minimizing unnecessary distress. This preparation often happens entirely invisibly from the child's perspective, who typically experiences only the final, carefully considered version of the conversation, with no direct awareness of the private deliberation uncertainty, or even rehearsal that may have preceded it. This reflects something meaningful about the particular kind of care many mothers bring, specifically to communication, an effort not simply to convey information, but to convey it in a way calibrated thoughtfully to a child's particular emotional needs and capacity to understand in that specific moment. If you can recall a difficult conversation from your own childhood, a piece of hard news, a sensitive explanation delivered with what seemed at the time like natural calm and clarity, there is a reasonable chance that calm was not entirely effortless, but rather the visible result of private preparation you never witnessed. Someone choosing her words carefully on your behalf, long before you ever heard them. Beyond simply preparing how to phrase difficult information, many mothers make deliberate, careful decisions about how much of a difficult situation to actually share with a child at all, weighing a genuine commitment to honesty against a simultaneous desire to protect a child from worry or distress that might not serve any real purpose. Researchers studying family communication describe this as a common and complex balancing act, particularly during situations involving illness, financial stress, or other adult difficulties. that a child may sense on some level, but cannot fully understand or meaningfully help resolve. Many mothers report deliberately choosing to present a calmer, more reassuring version of a difficult situation specifically for their child's benefit, not out of dishonesty in any harmful sense, but out of a considered judgment that a child's particular developmental stage and emotional capacity might not be well served by the full unfiltered weight of adult concerns. This kind of protective filtering requires real ongoing effort, continuously assessing what a child is genuinely ready to understand versus what might simply create unnecessary fear without offering any corresponding benefit. It often goes entirely unnoticed by the child receiving this careful calibration, who typically experiences the situation as simply less alarming than it may have actually been, without any awareness of the deliberate effort involved in making it appear that way. If you can recall a difficult period from your own childhood that in retrospect was likely more serious than it seemed to you at the time, this quiet, protective softening may well be part of the reason someone shielding you carefully, deliberately and largely invisibly, from a weight she judged you were not yet ready to fully carry. Beyond managing what information to share, many mothers also take on a considerable, largely invisible emotional role, functioning as a kind of steady emotional container for a child's difficult feelings, absorbing frustration, fear, distress, without necessarily displaying the internal strain that this absorption genuinely requires. Psychologists studying emotional regulation within families describe this as a form of emotional labor, the ongoing work of managing not only one's own emotional responses, but actively helping regulate a child's emotional experience as well, often while suppressing or postponing processing of one's own corresponding emotional reaction to the very same difficult situation. This might look like remaining outwardly calm during a child's meltdown, even while feeling genuinely overwhelmed internally, or offering steady reassurance during a frightening situation, even while privately feeling frightened as well. Researchers note that this particular kind of sustained emotional regulation, performed consistently over years of caregiving, represents a significant and largely uncounted form of labor, distinct from the more visible physical tasks of caregiving, discussed earlier yet demanding, in its own right, requiring near-constant self-monitoring and active emotional management. This labor often goes entirely unnoticed by the child on the receiving end, who typically experiences only the calm, reassuring presence being offered, without any direct awareness of the effort required to maintain that composure. If you can recall moments from your own childhood when you were upset, frightened, or overwhelmed, and someone remained steady and reassuring throughout it, is worth considering that this steadiness may not have come without real internal cost. Someone quietly managing her own difficult feelings in that same moment, specifically so that you would not have to manage them alongside her. The sustained emotional labor of consistently absorbing and regulating a child's difficult emotions performed repeatedly across years of caregiving does not appear to be without genuine physiological cost, even when it produces no immediately visible symptoms. Researchers studying the health effects of chronic emotional labor have found associations between this kind of sustained emotional suppression and regulation and various measures of long-term physical health, including cardiovascular, strain, and immune function patterns, broadly consistent with the effects of chronic stress discussed earlier in relation to the mental load. This particular form of stress differs somewhat from more general household stress, since it involves the specific ongoing effort of managing not only one's own emotional state, but actively regulating and absorbing another person's emotional experience as well, a kind of doubled emotional workload performed consistently over long periods of time. Health researchers note that this pattern, like many of the invisible costs discussed tonight, tends to accumulate gradually, rather than producing any single dramatic health event, making it particularly difficult to trace directly or to fully appreciate in the moment it is actually occurring. This helps explain why some of the long-term health effects associated with sustained caregiving may not become fully apparent until many years later, long after the most emotionally demanding years of active parenting have technically concluded. If someone in your life absorbed considerable emotional strain on your behalf throughout your own childhood, remaining steady and reassuring, so that you would not have to face difficult feelings entirely alone, it is worth recognizing that this steadiness, however invisible it may have seemed at the time, likely carried a real and lasting cost for her quietly over many years. Given the considerable weight of everything discussed so far tonight, the lost sleep, the reduced earnings, the delayed medical care, the absorbed emotional strain, it might be reasonable to expect that mothers themselves would describe their experience primarily in terms of sacrifice, burden, or cost. Yet research examining how mothers actually describe their own experience finds something notably different: a strong and consistent tendency to frame these same behaviors not as sacrifice in any burdensome sense, but simply and directly as love expressed through action, rather than through words. Psychologists studying maternal narratives note that mothers rarely use language emphasizing personal cost when describing their own caregiving choices. Even when directly asked about specific sacrifices, researchers have documented clearly, through separate, more objective measures. Instead, many mothers describe the very same behaviors in strikingly simple, almost understated terms, framing delayed sleep, postponed careers, or absorbed emotional strain, not as noteworthy sacrifices at all, but simply as what one naturally does for a child one loves deeply. This gap between the measurable objective scale of maternal sacrifice and the mother's own subjective framing of that same experience reveals something genuinely striking about how love itself often operates in practice, not as a feeling separate from action, but as something inseparable from it, expressed continuously through countless small, largely unacknowledged choices that a mother herself may never think to describe as sacrifice at all, simply because, from where she stands, it never quite felt like one. Somewhere tucked into a drawer or a folder rarely opened, there is a real possibility that a piece of paper still exists, bearing something you made as a small child: a crayon drawing a handwritten note, a small clumsy craft project kept carefully long after you yourself forgot it had ever existed at all. Researchers studying parental keepsakes have found this to be an extremely common pattern. Mothers preserving children's early creative efforts, not necessarily the most polished or impressive examples, but often simply the ones that happen to carry particular emotional weight in the moment they were made or given. You almost certainly have no memory of most of what you created as a young child, since early childhood memories rarely persist with any real detail or accuracy into adulthood. Yet somewhere, the physical evidence of that early creativity may still exist, carefully kept, occasionally rediscovered, and looked at again long after its original creator moved on entirely without a second thought to whatever came next. These kept items are rarely valuable in any conventional sense. Yet they persist for years, sometimes decades, functioning as small physical anchors to a specific, otherwise unrecoverable moment in time. If you were to ask your own mother, there is a genuine chance she could produce something you made as a small child, something you have no memory of creating, kept quietly all this time, not because it was remarkable, but simply because it was yours, made by hands that were, at the time, still small enough to need her help holding the crayon steady. Among the various sensory memories that tend to persist unusually vividly for mothers, smell occupies a particular well-documented place tied closely to how the human brain processes olfactory information through pathways closely connected to memory and emotion more directly than most other senses. Researchers studying memory have long noted that scent-based memories tend to be unusually durable and vivid compared to memories triggered by other senses, often remaining accessible and specific even decades after the original experience occurred. Many mothers report being able to recall with striking clarity the particular scent associated with a child's early years. A specific brand of shampoo, the particular smell of a nursery, sensory details entirely lost to the child's own memory, but preserved with unusual precision within the mother's. This kind of scent memory can sometimes trigger unexpectedly, decades later encountering a similar smell unrelated to the original context entirely, and finding oneself unexpectedly transported back to a specific, vivid memory of a child now fully grown. This is not something a mother typically works to maintain deliberately, but rather something that persists largely on its own, embedded deeply within neural pathways, established during a period of intense, repeated sensory exposure to a very particular, very specific environment. If you were to walk back into your own childhood bedroom today, assuming it still exists in anything like its original form, there is a real chance your mother could identify immediately, and specifically some particular scent she associates permanently with that space and that time, a sensory detail, entirely invisible to you, yet still vividly present within her. Auditory recognition, much like the scent-based memory discussed above, tends to develop with unusual specificity and durability when it comes to a mother's recognition of her own child, extending well beyond infancy into recognition patterns that can persist throughout that child's entire life. Many mothers report being able to identify their own child's footsteps, voice, or even particular patterns of movement through a house instantly and specifically, distinguishing them clearly from other family members or visitors without any conscious effort required to make that distinction. This kind of highly specific auditory recognition likely builds on the same underlying neurological patterns discussed earlier regarding infant cry recognition, extended and refined over years of sustained attentive exposure to one particular child's specific sounds and patterns of movement. Unlike the earlier infant recognition, tied closely to hormonal changes specific to that particular period, this later, more mature form of recognition appears to function more like any other deeply practiced skill, refined gradually over years of repeated, attentive exposure until it becomes almost entirely automatic and unconscious. If you have ever come home to your mother's house and been immediately identified by sound alone before you ever announced yourself, before she ever saw you directly, this reflects a real, well-documented pattern. Recognition built specifically and exclusively around you, refined patiently over the entire span of your shared life together, distinguishing you instantly and specifically from anyone else who might walk through that same door. Physiological research examining maternal responses to a child's voice has found something genuinely striking: measurable changes in a mother's heart rate and other physiological markers occurring specifically in response to hearing her own child's voice, distinct from her response to unfamiliar voices, a pattern that persists well beyond infancy and into her child's adulthood. This suggests that the deep early bonding discussed earlier in relation to newborn recognition establishes a physiological connection that does not simply fade once a child grows independent, but rather persists in measurable form throughout a mother's life, activated specifically and repeatedly by the particular sound of her own child's voice. Researchers studying this phenomenon note that this physiological response occurs largely automatically beneath conscious awareness, reflecting deep neurological pathways established early and reinforced continuously across years of shared life and communication. This might explain a common experience many adult children report: noticing a particular warmth or heightened attentiveness in a mother's voice specifically when speaking with them by phone. A subtle shift that reflects something real and measurable happening within her body in that exact moment, not simply a matter of tone or conscious politeness. If you have ever called your own mother simply to check in without any particular news to share, it is worth considering that the sound of your voice alone, regardless of what you actually said, may have produced a real physical response within her body. A quiet, automatic recognition built specifically around you, still active and still responsive even now, after all these years. What makes this particular physiological pattern especially notable is its persistence well into a child's full adulthood, extending far beyond any period where such heightened responsiveness might serve an obvious, practical, or protective purpose. Researchers studying long-term parent-child physiological connection have found that these measurable responses, changes in heart rate, skin conductance, and other markers of physiological arousal, continue to appear in mothers of fully grown adult children, sometimes even decades after that child has established a completely independent, self-sufficient adult life. This suggests that whatever biological and neurological foundations were established during early motherhood do not simply fade with time in any straightforward, linear way, but instead settle into something closer to a lasting, permanent feature of how a mother's body continues to respond specifically to her own child, regardless of that child's actual age or independence. This persistence occurs despite the fact that rationally, a mother fully understands her adult child no longer requires the same kind of protective vigilance that once seemed necessary during infancy, suggesting this particular physiological response operates largely independently of conscious, rational assessment of actual present-day risk or need. It is a quiet, biological form of permanence, one that exists regardless of distance, regardless of time past, regardless of how independent and capable that child has since become. Somewhere, if your own mother is still living, some part of her body likely still responds to you this way, specifically and uniquely, a physiological echo of a bond first established when you were far too small to have any awareness that such a bond was even being formed. There is a small, quietly poignant pattern that researchers studying the empty nest transition have documented among many mothers, small behavioral habits built up over years of active caregiving that persist for a considerable time after. They are no longer practically necessary, packing slightly more food than needed, setting a table for more people than currently live in the house. Habits performed almost automatically without conscious decision. These small behavioral remnants reflect the same kind of deeply reinforced pattern discussed in relation to other lingering caregiving instincts, habits built through years of consistent repetition that do not simply disappear the moment their original practical purpose ends. Psychologists studying this transition note that these small, seemingly minor behavioral patterns can sometimes trigger unexpected emotional moments for a mother catching herself mid-habit, packing food for a child who no longer lives at home and experiencing a small sudden wave of feeling connected directly to that momentary realization. These moments are rarely dramatic or overwhelming, but rather small, quiet, and easily overlooked, precisely the kind of detail that rarely gets mentioned or discussed openly, yet occurs with genuine regularity within many households navigating this particular life transition. If you have moved away from your own childhood home, there is a real possibility that somewhere your own mother has caught herself in a similar small moment, an old habit surfacing briefly, a quiet reminder of years spent caring for someone who for a long time now has been fully capable of caring for himself or herself. Among the various small artifacts many mothers leave behind across years of caregiving, handwritten notes occupy a particular quietly significant place, brief messages left in lunchboxes, on refrigerators, tucked into pockets or backpacks, often containing nothing more elaborate than simple, practical information, yet carrying, in retrospect, considerable emotional weight, simply by virtue of having been written by hand specifically for that particular child, in that particular moment. Researchers studying family communication note that handwritten notes carry a particular kind of intimacy, distinct from other forms of communication, reflecting a deliberate, physical investment of time and effort that more casual forms of communication simply do not require in quite the same way. Many adult children report keeping specific handwritten notes from their mothers for years, sometimes decades, long after the original practical purpose of that note has become entirely irrelevant, valuing it instead purely for the handwriting itself, a physical, tangible trace of a particular moment and a particular relationship that existed at the time it was written. This reflects something meaningful about how care expressed through small, ordinary acts can accumulate significance well beyond its original practical function, becoming over time something closer to a keepsake, a small physical reminder of attention and effort once given freely, without any expectation of it being specifically remembered or treasured later. If you still possess any handwritten note from your own mother, however brief, however purely practical its original content may have been, it is worth considering that the handwriting itself, the specific shape of her letters, the particular pressure of her pen, may carry meaning and comfort that the words alone could never fully capture on their own. There is a small, quietly telling administrative habit that researchers studying parental behavior have noted among many mothers: the continued maintenance of emergency contact information, medical details, and other practical records for children who have long since become fully capable adults, managing these exact same details entirely on their own. This habit often persists well past any genuine practical necessity. A mother continuing to keep an adult child's information updated in her own personal records, sometimes for reasons she herself might struggle to fully articulate if asked directly. Psychologists studying this pattern suggest it reflects the same underlying, persistent caregiving instinct discussed throughout tonight's exploration, a deeply ingrained sense of ongoing responsibility that does not simply switch off the moment it becomes technically unnecessary, but instead continues quietly in the background, manifesting through small practical acts of continued readiness. This is rarely framed by the mother herself as anything particularly significant, simply an ordinary administrative habit, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as mere organizational tendency, rather than something worth examining more closely. Yet it reflects something genuinely touching when considered directly: a continued quiet readiness to respond, if needed, maintained faithfully, year after year, for a child who statistically will likely never actually need that particular preparation again. If your own mother still has your outdated childhood pediatrician's number stored somewhere, still keeps an old medical record you have long since replaced with your own adult version, this reflects a small, ordinary, deeply human continuation of exactly the same vigilance that has quietly defined so much of what we have discussed together tonight. If you gather together everything discussed across this middle portion of tonight's exploration, the lingering sleep sensitivity, the persistent physiological responses, the small behavioral habits maintained long past their practical necessity, a clear and consistent pattern emerges. This particular kind of maternal vigilance, once established, appears remarkably resistant to fully disappearing, even decades after its original practical purpose has clearly passed. It does not typically announce itself dramatically or interfere significantly with a mother's otherwise fully independent adult life, since daily functioning clearly adapts and normalizes considerably as a child grows older and more self-sufficient. Instead, it persists, quietly, occasionally surfacing, in small, easily overlooked moments, a habit, a physiological response, a fleeting instinct, before receding again into the background of ordinary daily life. Researchers studying this long-term pattern describe it not as an active ongoing state of alertness, but rather as something closer to a permanent low-level readiness, built once through years of intensive caregiving, and never fully dismantled afterward, regardless of how genuinely unnecessary it has since become in practical terms. This is in its own quiet way one of the more striking patterns we have covered together tonight. This simple, well-documented fact that something built specifically for you during your own earliest and most vulnerable years appears to remain quietly present within your mother for the rest of her life, largely invisible, rarely mentioned yet never in any meaningful sense entirely gone. Memory researchers studying how parents recall their children's early years have found that these particular memories tend to surface not primarily through deliberate reflection, but rather spontaneously triggered unexpectedly during entirely unrelated, ordinary moments of daily life: folding laundry, driving a familiar route, standing in a grocery store aisle. This kind of spontaneous memory recall differs meaningfully from deliberate reminiscence, since it occurs without conscious intention, seemingly triggered automatically by some small, often unidentifiable environmental cue that happens to resemble in some subtle way an earlier moment from a child's younger years. Many mothers report this happening with genuine regularity throughout their lives. A brief, vivid memory of a child at a much younger age surfacing suddenly and unexpectedly, entirely unconnected to any deliberate effort to remember, before receding again, just as quickly back into the ordinary flow of daily thought. This suggests something meaningful about how thoroughly certain memories, particularly those tied closely to a child's early years, become woven into the ordinary fabric of a mother's mind, resurfacing not through effort, but simply because they remain so deeply and permanently embedded within it. If you were to ask your own mother whether she still finds herself unexpectedly thinking of you as a small child during ordinary unrelated moments of her day, there is a strong likelihood she would say yes, describing exactly this kind of spontaneous, unbidden memory, surfacing quietly and repeatedly all these years later, without her ever having to consciously search for it at all. Building directly on this pattern of spontaneous memory, researchers studying sensory-triggered recall have found that certain specific sensory cues, a particular song, a specific scent, a distinct texture, appear especially effective at triggering sudden vivid memories from years, or even decades, earlier. A phenomenon closely tied to how deeply sensory experiences become linked with emotional memory within the brain's structure. For many mothers, specific songs that were popular or personally significant during a child's early years can become powerfully, permanently associated with that particular period, capable of triggering an immediate, vivid memory even decades later, upon hearing that same song entirely by chance. This kind of sensory-triggered memory tends to arrive with unusual intensity and specificity compared to more deliberate forms of recollection, often accompanied by a strong emotional response that can feel, in the moment, almost as vivid as reliving the original experience itself, rather than simply remembering it from a distance. Researchers note that this particular kind of memory trigger appears to bypass more deliberate, effortful memory retrieval processes, entirely activating instead through more automatic sensory-based neural pathways that remain accessible and responsive, regardless of how much time has actually passed since the original experience occurred. If a particular song from your own early childhood were to play unexpectedly in your mother's presence today, there is a genuine chance it would transport her briefly but vividly back to a specific memory of you at a much younger age. Small, private moment of time travel triggered by nothing more than a few familiar notes still capable after all these years of bringing an entire earlier chapter of her life rushing back into full sudden clarity. There is a particular category of memory that researchers studying parental recall have found tends to persist with unusual clarity. A child's specific early fears, the particular thing that frightened you at a certain age, a specific sound, a specific object, an irrational worry unique to that particular period of your development. Many mothers retain remarkably specific memories of these early fears. Details a child themselves has typically long since forgotten entirely, having outgrown both the fear itself and any memory of ever having experienced it in the first place. This particular pattern of retention likely reflects the emotional attentiveness discussed earlier in relation to a mother's role in helping regulate and soothe a child's difficult emotions, since fears requiring active comfort and reassurance tend to become more deeply memorably encoded than more neutral, unremarkable moments from the same general period. A mother who spent considerable time and care specifically addressing a particular childhood fear, offering reassurance, checking closets, leaving on a particular light, may retain that specific memory with striking clarity, precisely because of the emotional investment that soothing required from her at the time. You, in all likelihood, have no memory whatsoever of whatever specifically frightened you as a very young child, since fears from that early an age rarely survive clearly into adult memory. Yet somewhere your mother may still recall it, precisely a small specific detail from your earliest years, preserved carefully within her memory alone, long after it ever meant anything at all to you. Among the many small behavioral patterns discussed tonight that persist quietly long after their original necessity has passed, researchers studying parental habit formation have noted a particularly common one: the habit of checking locked doors, windows, or other safety measures more than once a pattern that frequently begins specifically during early parenthood and often continues, largely unchanged for the remainder of a person's life. This habit typically develops during a period when a mother's heightened protective vigilance, discussed extensively throughout tonight's exploration, was at its most active and pronounced, checking and rechecking safety measures not out of anxiety in any clinical sense, but simply as a natural extension of a genuinely heightened protective instinct focused specifically on a vulnerable child. Once established, this particular habit tends to become deeply automatic, persisting well beyond the period when a child actually required this level of protective attentiveness, continuing quietly into a mother's later years, largely disconnected from its original, specific purpose. Psychologists studying long-term habit formation note that behaviors developed during periods of heightened emotional significance tend to become particularly resistant to fading entirely, even once their original context has changed considerably. If you have ever noticed your own mother checking a locked door a second time, seemingly out of pure habit rather than any specific present concern, this small, easily overlooked behavior likely traces back directly to a protective instinct, first activated specifically because of you still quietly present within her. All these years later, in the small, automatic gesture of a hand, returning once more to a door already locked. It is worth pausing directly on this particular detail, since it captures something meaningful about the broader pattern we have traced together across this middle portion of tonight's exploration. So many of these small lingering behaviors, the extra caution, the double-checked locks, the packed extra food, the updated emergency contacts, share a common origin point: a single, specific moment when a particular vigilance first activated, the moment a mother's child was born. From that specific moment forward, an entire constellation of protective instincts, behaviors, and physiological responses began quietly forming, gradually becoming deeply ingrained habits that, once established, appear remarkably resistant to fully fading even decades later. even long after their original specific purpose has clearly passed. This is not something any mother consciously decided to maintain indefinitely, nor something she likely ever examined closely enough to fully notice its own persistence. It simply happened gradually, automatically built, through years of consistent repetition, during a period when that vigilance was genuinely necessary, and never quite fully dismantled afterward. If you consider your own life and the specific moment of your own birth, it is worth recognizing that this exact moment likely marked the quiet beginning of an entire set of habits and instincts within your mother that in some meaningful sense are almost certainly still active within her today, all these years later, small and largely unnoticed, yet tracing back directly, consistently, to that single specific beginning. If there is one thread running consistently through everything we have explored together tonight, it is this quiet, persistent silence surrounding nearly all of it. The reshaped brain, the lost sleep, the delayed medical care, the absorbed emotional strain, the lingering vigilance that outlasts its own necessity by decades. Almost none of it, according to the research we have walked through together, tends to be spoken about directly, openly or fully, even by the mothers experiencing it most intimately. This silence is rarely deliberate concealment in any calculated sense, but rather something more diffuse, a combination of normalized habit, cultural expectation, and the simple, practical reality that so much of this particular kind of care was never designed to be noticed or acknowledged in the first place, only to function quietly and effectively in the background of someone else's life. Researchers studying maternal experience note that this silence can make it genuinely difficult for anyone, including the mother herself, to fully grasp the true scale of what has actually been given, since so much of it exists, specifically in the space between ordinary, unremarkable moments, easy to overlook, precisely because overlooking it was in some sense the entire point. This is where tonight's exploration begins, its final turn, away from information now and towards something gentler. Because if so much of this has gone unsaid for so long, then perhaps the most fitting thing left to do tonight is simply to notice it quietly together and let that noticing be enough. There is something worth letting settle over you now gently, as we near the end of this particular journey together. Everything we have traced tonight, the recognition built through scent and sound, the memories preserved with such unusual clarity, the small habits that never quite disappeared, all of it points toward one simple, steady truth. Somewhere, whatever small, particular sound your voice once made as a child, still lives clearly and specifically inside someone else's memory, undimmed by all the years that have passed since then. You do not need to do anything to preserve this. You never had to. It was never your responsibility to hold on to that early version of yourself, because someone else was already holding it carefully, without you ever having to ask. This is one of the quieter gifts woven through everything we have discussed tonight. The simple fact that so much of your earlier self was witnessed, recorded, and kept safe by someone whose attention never wavered even when you were far too young to notice it happening. You can let that thought rest gently now, without needing to examine it further. Somewhere, a version of you that no longer exists in your own memory continues quietly, safely inside someone who loved you before you could even understand what that word meant. That particular kind of safekeeping does not require anything further from you tonight, only the simple, quiet comfort of knowing it happened and that it remains softly still true. As you settle further into stillness now, consider this small, steady thought, gentle enough to carry you further toward rest, rather than pulling you back toward wakeful thinking. Somewhere, whether nearby or far away, whether in this moment fully awake or already asleep herself, some part of your mother's ongoing quiet vigilance is resting a little easier, simply because you are safe right now, exactly as you are. This does not require any effort from you. It does not require a phone call, a message, or any kind of proof. It simply exists quietly, as one small consequence of your own safety in this present moment, extending outward, gently, toward someone whose attention has been tuned to your safety for as long as you have existed. You do not need to carry this thought actively. You can simply let it rest alongside you, a small, warm certainty settled quietly into the room around you. Wherever she is tonight, some part of her continues holding you gently in mind, the way she has for your entire life, without needing anything from you in return, without requiring you to stay alert or aware of it in any active way. Let that be enough for now. Let it settle into your chest the way warmth settles into cold hands slowly held near a fire. You are safe. And somewhere, because of that simple fact alone, someone else is resting a little easier tonight too. We spoke earlier about vigilance, about how deeply it settles into a mother's body and mind, how long it lingers, how rarely it fully disappears. But vigilance, however persistent, was never meant to be carried forever, without any moments of genuine rest woven in between. And there is a small, gentle kind of reciprocity available to you right now, simply by allowing yourself to rest fully, completely, without reservation. Every time you allow yourself real deep rest, you are in some small way honoring exactly what that vigilance was always working to protect in the first place. You do not need to solve anything else tonight. You do not need to think further about sacrifice or scale or everything that has gone unspoken for so long. You only need to let your body soften now, degree by degree, the way tension slowly releases from tired shoulders once they are finally fully supported. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts loosen their grip one by one, the way a hand slowly opens after holding something tightly for a very long time. Somewhere, all of that careful, quiet vigilance we have spent tonight exploring together was always at its core, aimed toward this exact outcome, toward you safe, resting, undisturbed. You can let it do its work now quietly, without needing to think about it any further. Just rest. That is enough. That has always quietly been enough. Think for just a moment gently, and without any weight attached to it, of all the uninterrupted sleep discussed earlier tonight, the hours lost, the nights fragmented again and again by a small voice calling out in the dark. That particular sacrifice was real. It happened night after night for months, sometimes years, quietly and without complaint. And there is something genuinely peaceful available to you now, simply by allowing yourself the full, uninterrupted rest that she so often could not have during those earliest years of your life. You are not required to stay alert tonight. No one needs you to wake at a particular sound, to listen carefully through the dark for a particular cry, to keep some part of your mind quietly on watch while the rest of you tries to sleep. Tonight that vigilance belongs to someone else or to no one at all, simply because it does not need to be carried by you right now. You can let your body sink fully into whatever surface is holding you. You can let your breathing settle into something slow and unhurried. You can allow every part of you, down to the smallest, most restless corner of your mind, to finally stop listening for anything at all. This rest is not something you need to earn. It is simply quietly yours tonight, freely given the way so much was once quietly given to you long before you had any way of understanding just how much it truly was. If there is one single gentle intention worth carrying with you into sleep tonight, let it be this. Somewhere quietly, underneath every sacrifice we have traced together across this long, careful journey, there was one consistent, unspoken wish that you someday would be safe enough, secure enough, cared for enough, to simply rest without worry. That wish was never spoken aloud in quite these words, but it lived inside nearly everything we discussed tonight, inside the lost sleep, the delayed meals, the quiet vigilance that never fully switched off. And tonight, simply by allowing yourself to rest fully, you are in a small but genuine way receiving exactly what that wish was always reaching toward. You do not need to do anything more than this. You do not need to earn this rest through any particular achievement or effort. It was always meant to be given freely, the way so much else was given freely to you throughout your earliest years, without condition, without expectation of anything in return. Let your body settle now heavier and softer with every breath. Let your thoughts slow, one by one, like a house gradually going dark room by room, until only a single quiet light remains. That single light is simply this thought, warm and steady, that resting well tonight is not separate from everything we have discussed, but is in its own quiet way the gentlest possible continuation of it. There is nothing you need to do tonight to settle any of what we have discussed. No debt has been created by hearing it. No obligation now rests on your shoulders simply because you understand more clearly now how much was quietly given. Love of this particular kind, the kind we have spent so long tracing together tonight, was never built around repayment. It does not keep score. It does not wait quietly for the exact moment it might finally be returned in equal measure. It simply moves forward the way water moves forward, finding its own gentle path, extending outward across time without needing anything back in return. If you carry anything at all from tonight, let it simply be this: quiet awareness, softened now, not sharpened, not urgent, not something requiring immediate action. Let it settle into you the way understanding settles slowly into a tired mind late at night, without needing to be examined too closely. You are allowed to simply receive what has been given, without needing to immediately find some way to give it back in equal measure. That was never the arrangement. It was never meant to be. Let your breathing continue slowing now, gently, steadily, each breath a little heavier than the one before it, carrying you further toward the kind of full, complete rest that was always quietly hoped for on your behalf long before you ever had a way of understanding just how much that simple hope was worth. We spoke quite early in tonight's journey of small fetal cells settling permanently within a mother's own body, tiny physical traces that remain long after birth, has separated two bodies that were once entirely one. There is a quiet symmetry worth resting on now gently as sleep continues drawing closer, just as something of you remains within her. Something of her earliest care almost certainly remains within you as well. Not in cellular form necessarily, but in the deeper, quieter architecture of how your own nervous system first learned what safety felt like, what comfort sounded like, what being cared for actually meant long before you had any language to describe any of it. That early template, built patiently across your earliest months and years, still lives somewhere inside you tonight, quietly present, even now, shaping in small ways how your own body responds to comfort, to warmth, to the simple experience of finally letting go, into rest. You do not need to search for it directly. You do not need to think hard about where exactly it lives within you. You can simply trust that it is there. The way you trust your own heartbeat continues steadily without requiring your active attention. Let that quiet early foundation hold you now gently, the way it once held you long before you had any memory of it at all, carrying you now, just as it did then, softly toward sleep. Somewhere within everything discussed tonight, beneath the statistics, the research, the careful accounting of sacrifice and scale, there was always one simple, quiet hope running underneath it all, that you would someday know real rest, safety, real peace, even in moments when she herself could not fully access those same things during your earliest years. This hope did not need to be spoken directly to be real. It lived instead inside the actions themselves, inside every soothed cry, every carefully worded difficult conversation, every quietly absorbed worry that never made its way to you directly. Tonight, as you continue settling further into stillness, you are in a small but genuine way, finally receiving exactly what that quiet hope was always reaching toward. You do not need to hold on to anything else right now. You do not need to carry forward any of the information, the numbers, the careful details we traced together earlier tonight. You can simply let all of it recede gently now, replaced instead by this single, softer thought, warm and steady beneath everything else. Rest was always meant for you, wanted for you, hoped for you, long before you ever had the words to understand just how much that simple wish was worth. Let it arrive now, finally, completely, exactly as it was always meant to. There is nothing complicated required of you now, nothing left to think through or carefully consider. Simply closing your eyes tonight, letting your body finally soften completely into whatever is holding you, is itself a small, quiet way of receiving everything we have spent this time exploring together. You do not need to do this perfectly. You do not need to force sleep to arrive on any particular schedule. You only need to let go gradually, gently, the way a held breath slowly releases, once it finally remembers it was never meant to be held so tightly in the first place. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw loosen. Let whatever thoughts remain simply drift unhurried, without needing to be followed all the way to any particular conclusion. Somewhere quietly, this exact moment, you resting, you finally letting go, is precisely what so much of what we discussed tonight was always working toward. You are not required to stay alert any longer. You are not required to keep track of anything else. You are simply allowed fully and completely to rest now, exactly as you are carried gently toward sleep by something far older and far steadier than anything either of us could fully put into words tonight. As we come now to the closing of everything we have shared together tonight, let this final thought settle over you slowly, like the last light easing gently out of a room. Wherever your mother is tonight, whether near or far, whether awake or already resting herself, some quiet part of her built long ago and never fully switched off, continues hoping gently and without demand that you are safe, that you are comfortable, that you are finally fully at rest. You do not need to confirm this. You do not need to reach out or explain anything at all. You only need to let yourself receive it quietly, the way you might receive warmth from a fire across a room without needing to move closer or say anything in return. Let your breathing continue slowing now. Let your body grow heavier, softer, more completely at ease with every passing moment. Everything we have traced together tonight, all of it was always leading gently toward this single, quiet destination, you resting fully, safely, completely. There is nothing more required of you now. There is nothing left to understand or carry forward. There is only this simple and complete rest now, exactly as you are held gently by everything that came before you, and everything that continues quietly to hope for your peace tonight. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Until next time, good night.